Good morning and welcome everyone to the 9th meeting of the Local Government and Communities Committee this year. Please ensure all mobile phones are in silent, and a reminder that broadcasting will operate your camera and microphone as usual. And please allow a short pause before being called on to speak to allow them to do so. This morning I have apologies from Andy Whiteman for items 1 and 2, but he will be joining us at item 3. At agenda item 1, we have consideration of whether to take agenda item 5 in private. Agenda item 5 is consideration of the evidence heard on Fair Rents Scotland Bill. As we're meeting remotely, rather than asking whether everyone agrees, I will instead ask if anyone objects. If there's silence, I will assume you are content. Does anyone object? Thank you. Therefore, that is agreed. Item 5 will be taken in private. Agenda item 2, the committee is taking evidence on Fair Rents Scotland Bill. This is the first of 2 evidence sessions on the bill today, picking up on some of the issues raised by respondents to our calls for views. And I welcome our first panel, which is John Blackwood, Chief Executive, Scottish Association of Landlords, Tony Kane, Policy Manager, Association of Local Authority Chief Housing Officers, and Gordon Maloney, National Committee Member, Living Rent. Thanks for being here today and for your written submissions. For information, we've allocated about an hour for this session. Before we start, I'll go over some brief technical information. There's a pre-arranged questioning order, and I will call each member in turn to ask their questions for a block of up to 9 minutes. It would help broadcasting if members could indicate who in the panel their questions are addressed to. We may have a short amount of time for supplementary questions at the end. As there are 3 in the panel, please indicate clearly if you wish to answer the question, for instance by raising your hand, and don't feel the need to answer every question fully if your views are generally in line with points already made. And could everyone give broadcasting staff a second to operate your microphones before you speak. Polly McNeill, the member in charge, is also in attendance for today's evidence session, and I will allow her to come in at the end for questions to panellists if time allows. So we'll now move on to questions. And my first question is, do you agree that there is a need to bring fairness into the private rented sector and to create a better balance of powers between landlords and tenants in Scotland? Gordon Maloney?
Absolutely, and I think the evidence that we've seen kind of speaks for itself. And one of the things that we would point to is that over the course of the pandemic, that power imbalance has been made very clear. So in the Scottish Association of Landlords' response to this, they cite a handful of examples of cases where landlords have been fairly generous with their tenants. We could cite just as many examples of cases where landlords frankly have acted disgracefully, hiking rents, refusing to make repairs, treating tenants appallingly over the course of the last 12 months. And one of the things that has been frustrating for us has been that the Scottish Government's approach to the issue of rent during the pandemic, so not evictions, but rent, is that where tenants are facing difficulty, they should speak to their landlord and in good faith try and negotiate some kind of reduction. Sometimes that's worked. We've had a reasonable amount of success doing that. But what we've seen is that precisely because of that power imbalance, that is very difficult to do. We've spoken to lots of tenants facing extremely difficult financial situations who were too afraid to even speak to their landlord because they were worried about retaliatory evictions, retaliatory rent increases, or other forms of harassment. We had a tenant just recently who successfully took their landlord to court for unlawfully for harassment and for failing to protect their deposit. And since then, they've been harassed and shouted at in the street by their landlord. So I think what we see is that across the board, the cards are all in the hands of landlords, and tenants have very little option. And so
Okay, so sorry for interrupting you, Gordon, but sure. Tell me, explain then how this bill, which is solely about rents, changes that imbalance.
Well, so rents are one of the key exacerbating factors for tenants. In the 2016 Act, the Scottish Government brought in, and we were supportive at the time, we think these were positive changes, a number of measures to protect tenants from eviction and give greater security. But in the absence of measures to limit the amount that rents can be increased by, we see tenants fearing either for good reason or just because of experience that they've had in the past, that they can still be evicted by rent increases. And so one of the things that the Scottish Association of Landlords response cites in this is that they claim that rents are not set by not set by landlords, they're a simple matter of supply and demand. But this imbalance means that the worst thing that can happen to a landlord is that they spend a few more days without a tenant in the property if they choose not to take someone because they don't feel like they're offering the rent that they deserve. But for a tenant, they face homelessness. They face not having somewhere to live.
Sorry, I'm going to let others come in here,
Sure.
but surely there's already been legislation that has started to combat that imbalance, as you speak about there. It's not as easy for landlords to get rid of tenants as it was previously. And we are talking about fair rents here.
Sure, it's still reasonably easy. So the tribunal, all of their decisions are public, and you can see that almost no one. I think there's been one successful case where a tenant has challenged an unlawful eviction. We've had cases where tenants have reported repair issues and have been told weeks later that their landlord is choosing to move into the property, only for that property to reappear on Gumtree weeks later. And I want to be clear that I'm not saying that every landlord does this, but we need protections to stop the ones that do. And landlords who aren't doing those sorts of things don't have anything to fear from that. And on rent,
we are veering away from the purposes of this bill. But thanks for that, Gordon. Can I bring in Tony Kane, please?
Thank you. And in answer to your question, absolutely yes, there is a need to rebalance the relationship between tenants and landlords. And this Act probably doesn't go far enough. We weren't supportive of the 2006 Act at the time, and I said to this committee that I regarded it essentially as a landlord charter and didn't do enough to protect the rights of tenants, created far too many mandatory grounds for repossession, including if a landlord is convicted of a criminal offence and deregistered, the tenant is then at risk of being summarily evicted because it's a mandatory ground if a landlord isn't registered. So there are substantial problems in the way the sector operates. The 2016 Act entrenches some of those difficulties, and significant reforms are required across the board in the sector. So, but the other point to make is that we're not here talking about fair rents. Fair rents are defined in the Rent Scotland Act 1984. Unfortunately, the briefing note that goes with this bill is incorrect in the way it describes that Act. The 84 Act required rents to be set on the basis of a balanced market, and that's the way you set fair rents, and that is the level and type of rent control that would actually have an impact on rebalancing the sector and putting tenants in a better and fairer position. But I have to say, if you're going to move towards that kind of rent regulatory system, then you also have to have a policy process of creating that balanced market. And we aren't having a proper conversation about how we ensure that the private rented sector itself is functioning in the market in the right way. And at the moment, it contains far too many, it's providing housing for far too many vulnerable and low-income households. Something like a quarter of Scotland's poorest households are currently in the private rented sector, and they should be in the social rented sector.
John Blackwood.
Thank you, Convener. I think one issue with this bill that it does highlight is how there is this perceived concern about increasing in rents and how unaffordable that is. But my concern, as we've represented within a submission, is that actually this bill will just further exacerbate that. We believe it will result in higher rents and more frequent rent increases. So any perceived imbalance, I think, will be exacerbated. Something that we are very much emphasising within the submission is that actually we need to understand the sector more. We need to understand exactly what rents are being charged, not just being marketed. And even from our own membership, obviously, we have an understanding as to what they're telling us and what rents they're charging. But we don't know if that represents the entire private rent sector in Scotland. So we certainly support within this bill the need for greater rent data and an understanding of the exact position of rents and what's being charged in Scotland.
That leads me on nicely to it. How robust is the data on rents? I mean, what evidence is there about the impact of rising rents causing affordability problems for tenants, for example?
I don't think it's robust at all, and I think that's certainly what this bill tries to address, and I think is an important aspect of this bill. Certainly we don't have an understanding of what it is nationally or indeed locally, and all we have is data related to rents that are marketed. We don't even know if those rents are actually achieved. And of course, the bigger part of the private rented sector are those who are in existing tenancies. So are their rents increasing? As you'll see from our submission, we contend that they're not increasing. But actually, we need to get real data on that. We need to understand that more.
And this bill, correct me if I'm wrong here, but this bill would only affect those that were already in tenancies.
It would, yeah. So it's not actually touching market rents at all. And certainly, if you do look at existing tenancies, I say we need to sustain tenancies as best as we possibly can. That's an interest, of course, of tenants wanting to secure a home in the longer term, but it's in the best interest of private landlords that I represent too. They want to see tenants in tenancies and continuing. But we need to understand exactly, as I say, what rents have been charged.
Okay, thanks very much for that, everybody. Sarah, would you like to come in?
Very much, Convener. And first of all, could I draw members' attention to my register of interest with my former work with SFHA? I'd like to ask slightly different questions of each of the panellists, but they're all focused around, effectively, do we need this legislation, and is it the right kind of legislation? Can I kick off with Tony Kane from Alacho? Because you were talking about that we do need an approach which addresses the challenges we've got, and you referred to the need for a balanced market that had fairer rents. So I'd just like you to say which of the bits in the bill you think would be helpful, because you basically said we need more affordable housing, but that's not happening at the scale that would make the impact anytime soon. So in terms of this bill, what are the key things that you think are actually worth us looking at, and where you're particularly keen that this bill needs to be changed?
I mean, this is a bill of two halves as far as we're concerned. The proposals to improve the data collection are very welcome and very important. We need much better information. John's already said what we know about rents is essentially based on asking rents rather than passing rents. The rents are actually being paid. We can't track properties within the sector because of the way the IT system that landlord registration uses. So we don't know when properties were first registered, and we don't know if they leave the system and come back, and the same in relation to landlords as well. So I think our view is that we need is a comprehensive review of the data requirements that we need at national level, so that we can make properly informed policy decisions about the intervention of the private rented sector, but also at local level, so it supports regulatory oversight and intervention. So we need a comprehensive review of our data sets and our data gathering across private renting. I would extend that to the whole of the housing system. Our data sets at the moment are, I think, denuded is the word I would use. They're not really fit for purpose, and we need to think about them again and look at how we improve them. So those bits of this bill that relate to data, improving the data, are important. They point to a key weakness, and I absolutely support those moves. I would take them significantly further. On the rent control issues, what the bill effectively does is creates an implied term in every tenancy that rents will go up by CPI plus 1% every year. Now, that's higher than the long-run rate of rent increases in the sector in Scotland, and certainly higher than it is in most parts of the market. And the problem is it's a blunt tool in terms of setting a single rate across Scotland, when actually what you need is a much more nuanced approach. And I think our preference would be that you focus that approach directly on the relationship between landlords and tenants, and you create a framework, or you extend the framework, so that tenants can appeal rents to the rent officer and, if necessary, the first tier tribunal, and that those rents should be based on a balanced market, a fair rent, rather than a market rent. But in order to do that, if you're going to do that, you do need to look at the policy options to move the private rented sector back to or into a market niche that's appropriate for a market sector. And that's not where it is at the moment. We have something like 40% of private tenants paying more than 30% of their net income on rent. That's not a target, it's an indication of pressure. That's too many, and there are too many people under substantial financial pressure in the sector, and that puts them in an even weaker position when it comes to dealing with their landlords. So it's, we need to be clear what role we think the private rented sector should play in the broader housing market in Scotland, and then we need a policy framework properly informed by the data that drives the sector into that niche.
Okay, and can I move on to Gordon from Living Rent, because you're also very sympathetic to the principle of fairer rents, but you're worried about the mechanism used of the metric, the CPI. And we've just heard from Tony Kane that he doesn't like the principle of the CPI plus one because it potentially leads to increased rents. Can you say what your alternative would be, Gordon, if you were able to amend this bill?
Sure. So we would agree with everything that Tony just said, that the CPI plus 1% is too high, not just because that would represent an increase in excess of what lots of big parts of Scotland have seen, although many places, particularly urban areas, have seen increases far above inflation. But our view is that rents in many parts of the country are already too high, and that we should be starting from a perspective of bringing them down and then stabilising, rather than just locking in above inflation increases at this stage. I think Tony's right that we need a nuanced approach that recognises the different circumstances in different parts of Scotland. And in our submission, what we suggest is that this the CPI plus 1% would be the maximum amount that rent could be increased, but that local authorities, broad market rental areas would be able to set smaller increases, smaller caps with no cap on what those would be. And we make one point on this, that our view, and we represent this in our submission, is that it is vital that any increases are grandfathered or sometimes referred to as second generation, and that they carry over from tenancy to tenancy. Not just because of the point John made earlier, that otherwise it only protects or impacts sitting tenants. But actually, if you don't do that, then you don't have a meaningful impact on rent levels in the long term. You just make increases kind of more jaggedy rather than a more stable curve. Now, this is a private member's bill, and I appreciate that there are logistical restraints around that. But we have published substantial research on this, and it's interesting because rent controls are often treated as some kind of fringe far left policy, but the reality is that almost everywhere in Europe, including the UK for the best part of 80 years, have had rent controls over the last century, and there is a wealth of peer-reviewed academic research about exactly what works and what doesn't, and be very happy to share the policy that we've pulled together, taking what we think are the best parts from the different models across Europe and the States, and that we think works best for Scotland. The short version is that we think rents need to be tied to quality, because as well as unaffordability being an issue for many tenants in Scotland, every second private rented home fails the Scottish Government's own the standards, and in some cases that's very serious. We think rent controls could be a powerful tool for incentivising landlords to make improvements on properties in a way that currently, the things that are currently in place don't work. So we think this is an important step forward. There are amendments we'd make, but we would agree with Tony that in some very substantial ways it doesn't go far enough. And the bill is what it is before us, and we'd support some tweaks to reflect that. But we are also going into an election, and I'd urge members to consider what that might mean in terms of manifestos.
Okay, so if I stick with this bill, you've talked about different mechanisms. We've actually got mechanisms that could have a more area-based approach. Rent control zones. Nobody's used them. Why not?
Mm-hmm. It's a very good question. So rent pressure zones, which were introduced in 2016, you're right, no council has been able to use them. That is despite a number of councils trying. Edinburgh City Council, I believe, were the first to commission a feasibility study. And what they found was that the data required to make a successful application to the Scottish Government simply doesn't exist. And in their feasibility study that they published, they outlined correspondence with the Scottish Government where they asked for support collecting that data and were told in no uncertain terms that the Scottish Government would not help them doing that. And that's very unfortunate, because it would be a relatively simple process. And I think this bill goes some of the way towards that. But our view is that rent pressure zones are insufficient anyway, for some of the reasons that we've already heard. The minimum cap in a rent pressure zone is only CPI plus 1%, which we believe is too high. They only protect tenants within tenancies, which we don't think will have a long-term impact on rent levels. And there's some evidence from elsewhere, for example, in Germany, where there's some evidence that those sorts of caps only within tenancies risk creating a situation where landlords artificially increase rents in between tenancies to compensate for reduced ability to increase rents within them. And that means that maybe if you're in the tenancy for the full 4 or 5 years of a rent pressure zone, that you benefit or it balances out. But for some of the most vulnerable tenants, people who are maybe only there for 6 or 12 months, that they're not protected at all. And the feasibility study in Edinburgh found, I believe, that the average tenancy in this city is only 18 months. So rent pressure zones also don't touch quality. So the proposals in this bill, I think, are better. The prospect of grandfathering those increases from tenancy to tenancy is vitally important, and the prospect of factoring in quality issues to rent assessments in the tribunal or with a rent officer are also vitally important. But rent pressure zones have failed on their own terms, and our view is that even if it was made simpler and easier for councils to apply rent pressure zones to an area, that as a measure it's insufficient anyway.
Okay, thank you. I see I've run out of my time, convener. Does that mean I don't get a chance to?
You can ask the question to John if you've got one.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we've heard from both previous witnesses that we need more homes, and that's one of your suggestions. The only effective solution is to supply more homes. In the meantime, John Blackwood, it's been suggested that we've got rents that are being paid for properties that are not meeting proper Scottish Government standards. Is that something that should be more of a priority at the moment? How would your members approach that issue without new legislation? And would you accept that, in fact?
Yeah, I think the first thing to point out is, of course, we have legislation to tackle that issue, and certainly we as an organisation on behalf of our members would support proper use of that legislation. It is unacceptable that there's substandard accommodation in the private rented sector, or any housing sector for that matter, and we need to take urgent action to address that. There's been a lot of moves to be able to do that through other bills and legislation that's introduced the Parliament over the last 10 years. But it's all very well having the legislation in place. I think Tony was alluding to this, that we need to actually have proper enforcement of the existing legislation. And that's what the emphasis needs to be on. So obviously I'm keen to see a well-functioning private rented sector that's providing a good service to tenants and is sustainable for the long term. We need a private rented sector. But there's so many pressures on that private rented sector at the moment to house everybody effectively. And I don't believe that the private rented sector is certainly the best place for perhaps some of the most vulnerable people in Scotland. So therefore we would, as others have indicated, advocate for a greater social rented sector where affordable rents can be offered to tenants and should be.
We're not going to reach that happy world for some time. So in the meantime, you've suggested that we should have more data collected and we should use the existing rent pressure zones. Is that practical? Is that actually going to happen?
I think it is, because from what I understand, the Scottish Government is working with a few local authorities to determine just how they could make these rent pressure zones workable. So I think there are bare bones of legislation there to be able to address this issue of where we could have rents which rise and continue to grow. I don't believe that's happening in Scotland at the moment, but it could do and has happened in the past. So therefore we need to have control measures to be brought in and address that issue. But again, without the data, we don't know what rents are being charged, and therefore how can we control it if we don't actually know what the problem is? So I think that the starting point is get that rent data sorted.
So to clarify, your members would be prepared to provide data on rents that isn't currently publicly available? Exactly,
and we do. We work very closely with Rent Services Scotland. We provide that data. They come to us and ask us, can you give us data on existing tenancies and passing rents? And we encourage them to do that. And that's a process we go through periodically. But I understand that's a difficult job for Rent Services Scotland, because how can they accurately gather that data? And I think landlord registration would be an appropriate tool to be able to harvest that information.
Thanks, Convener.
Right, thank you, Super. Alexander?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. Can I just follow on some issues with John Blackwood that you've already touched on this morning, Mr. Blackwood? You know, we've talked about already having a balanced market, and we've talked about a rent policy. And, you know, it's quite apparent that there are good landlords out there, no question about that. There are also rogue landlords, and we are aware of some of that taking place and the difficulties that some tenants are put through because of that. But when we're talking about the rent itself, that seems to be the crux about affordability, supply and demand, about what is being proposed and what is being provided. So if there were, what other impacts would limit rent increases have on landlords? So if the rents have to be tailored, if they have to be reduced, if they have to be classified as being fairer, what impact would that have on landlords within your organisation?
How we feel that both tenants and landlords would be adversely affected through this potential bill here, this legislation that we're looking at. So, for instance, landlords do rely on the fact that we need to have that rental income to be able to maintain and as well as upgrade the property going forward. So any limit on rent that can be charged will have an adverse effect on what they can invest in that property to, as I say, maintain and repair. There's also been increased costs in taxation over the last few years as well too. And of course, that all comes out of the rental income effectively. Going forward, we need to ensure that the private rented sector has proper energy efficient homes that they provide to tenants. Again, any investment in that, it's not tax deductible, it's seen as an improvement. So therefore, landlords need to be able to find additional resources to be able to invest in these properties going forward. That's the right thing to do. Landlords are actually saying to us, they want to invest in their properties, but you can only do that if you've actually got the money to be able to sustain that long term.
And if I can ask the other panel members, would the power of Scottish ministers to vary the application of a fair rent cap address any concerns you have? And at what circumstances do you think the power should be used? If I can go to Gordon first and then Tony.
Yeah, so I think as we've heard, there are some, we would support that. And the reason is that, as we've heard, there are some places where rents have consistently increased above inflation. The most recent City Lets report gives an increase of 40% over the last 10 years in Edinburgh and 44% in Glasgow, and places like that. Clearly, that those are increases well in excess of inflation. But there are other places where they haven't been that high. And as John alludes to, that having a cap of inflation plus 1%, there's a very real risk that acts as an incentive. And for that reason, we would support a stronger measure that imposes stricter limits in some places. And I just want to pick up on one thing about supply. As Tony has mentioned, the private rented sector is currently serving people it was never designed to. It's tripled in size since the 90s. And one of the things that means is, in order to strike that balance, we need to be quite comfortable with the sector shrinking. And so you hear a lot about supply and demand and increased rent, reduced rents, reducing the amount of landlords in the sector. And I think actually that's something that we should probably be quite comfortable with. The sector has spiraled out of control, not because tenants are exercising free choice, but because house prices have increased exponentially, wages have stagnated for a long time, and of course social housing we're still suffering the impact of right to buy and of social housing across Scotland being demolished and not being replaced in the ways it should be. And so you find an entire generation of particularly young people, but increasingly people into their 40s, people retiring into the private rented sector, people having kids in the private rented sector in a way that the sector was never designed for, and that can't give those people security. So if one of the consequences of reducing rents is that landlords choose to sell properties, perhaps to families currently renting who would much rather buy, I think that's something that we should welcome and embrace.
Thank you. And Tony?
Yeah, I think I would rather they sold many of these properties back into the social rented sector so that they can be properly maintained and rented out at properly affordable rents. But I agree, the sector's too big and we need to manage it down. There is a very important role for a high quality market-led private rented sector. It adds flexibility to the market, it adds choice to the market, but it needs to be there for people who are choosing to be in that sector because it suits them for a variety of reasons rather than where we are. I think a variable cap, and go back to the original question, a variable cap would be an improvement. But the housing market in Scotland is so complicated and so nuanced that I don't think ministers will struggle to keep up with a number of variations that would be required to reflect the variation in the rural market, in our remote and island communities, and in some of our urban areas too. So my problem is that it seems to me to be too blunt a tool in that respect. And we probably need to focus on some of the bigger picture issues about how we transform our housing market more generally. People frequently say it's broken, but I struggle to find anybody trying to set out what a fixed housing market looks like, and creating a proper sector for the private rented sector. And we have clear examples of that. I mean, there is unquestionably a place for a premium and a high quality private rented sector, charging premium rents to people who are choosing that option. There's also, and I think Homes for Good in Glasgow have demonstrated, a place for the community interest model and the work that Susan Actonell has done in single-handedly developing that proposition. So it can be varied. It isn't necessarily all about premium, but it does need to be fundamentally about choice. I mean, the last point to make is I worry a little bit about the way quality is talked about. Housing quality shouldn't be negotiable. I mean, we need to be clear that the physical quality of a property isn't something that should be the subject of market forces. They should meet not a minimum standard, they should meet an absolutely clear, acceptable standard for a decent house. Rents around whether it's a house or a flat, whether it's big or small, those are the points of variation rather than on quality itself. But the other thing is about the culture of the sector. The private rented sector, and this is not universal, but as a sector, it doesn't focus very much on service quality and the interests of tenants and the way in which tenants experience the sector. It focuses very much on property rights, that means landlord rights, and on the interests of the landlord themselves. So you need to change that culture. And I kind of, to be fair, John is a notable and honourable exception in that, and he understands the issue of service quality, and many of the landlords he represents do as well, but far too few of the rest do. And without over-egging it, we have a substantial problem of an association between private renting and criminality, and serious and organised crime, and we are not making headroads in removing those factors from the sector.
And finally, to all of you, you've talked about the market and the premier side of things that may happen in some of our big cities that have that opportunity to put out properties that can gain and support. But can I ask you about the rurality of issues? The smaller communities, the length and breadth of Scotland, borders or in the Highlands or whatever, where there is a real demand to try and keep that community together by providing housing, and some of it has to be in the rented sector for those people to stay and to create that environment. They have a job and the connectivity and all of the rest that we're trying to achieve. How can that be achieved through this bill? Is there any opportunity for that to be realistically a proposal in what's being proposed in this bill?
Presumably, my microphone's still on, so I'm going to carry on talking. Presumably, there will be an island proofing exercise associated with this, as there needs to be. I think we need to acknowledge that in many of our rural communities, the private rented sector is the biggest part of the rented sector. The social sector has almost disappeared. It has disappeared in many communities. So it plays a critical role. This is not about attacking private landlords or attacking the private rented sector. This is about managing the housing system so it meets a variety of needs in an appropriate way, which the private rented sector is simply not doing. And in rural areas, there's a strong case for investment in community-based models of housing, either through housing associations, community interest companies, or local authorities. And I don't think we can expect the private rented sector to meet housing needs. That's not what it's there for. It's not why landlords get involved in the sector. Meeting housing needs and creating a balanced market is the provision and the preserve of public policy.
Thank you. And
can I ask the next speakers to be short in their responses, please?
And I would agree with everything that Tony said. And I think the Scottish Government's efforts around Gaelic-speaking communities are one of the areas where this is really clear, that young people in the Highlands and Gaelic-speaking communities are forced out of their areas because they can't afford housing. And whilst supply is an issue, not to put too fine a point on it, but we've had 40 years of private landlords being able to charge whatever they want in rent, and that hasn't answered the supply question. So we have to start to think seriously about the issues that Tony's raising. But in the meantime, while we wait for these new models to come into place, we need to answer in the short term, in the immediate term, the question of affordability in the sector. And these long-term questions about how do we rebalance the sector, how do we increase social housing provision, those are there. They can't happen overnight, and there's a danger that they cost a huge amount of money to the public purse. And so we see immediate fixes as something urgent to address the challenges in the sector in the short term.
Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you very much. Keith?
Convener, I'm conscious that Gordon said that the sector is trying to do something which it wasn't designed for, but I'm not aware that the sector's ever been designed, to be honest. Can I ask about Tony's point about the if you like, the bottom of the market in terms of income, the poorer side of the market, 1/3 to 40%, I think Tony said. Is it Tony's view that this really shouldn't have a part to play in this sector, that the sector really should be about, you know, mid-market rents or higher rents, and really we should deal in other ways with those that don't have the income to pay the rents that are there? And he mentioned also, more generally, a balanced market. What are the other factors which you think would help lead to a balanced market beyond what he's already mentioned?
Those are complicated questions and not necessarily directly related to this bill, but a balanced market would be one where we are clear about the roles that the various sector plays and how big they're likely to be and what the pricing structure is likely to be across them. Our social rented sector, for example, ranges from around 12% of the stock in East Renfrewshire to 32 or 33% of the stock in West Dumbarton, Inverclyde and Glasgow. Now, I don't know how you judge either of those as being balanced markets. I think the core of this is about choice and affordability. It's about price across the board, and being clear that the purpose of interventions in the housing market is to deliver choice and to deliver affordable options and high quality options. I think our difficulty has always been, and certainly for the last 40 years, has been that we haven't been entirely clear what it is we're trying to achieve in housing policy. We've continued to invest in social housing, although the numbers over the piece have gone down. They've not gone up. In the last 20 years, we have fewer social rented homes now than we did have 20 years ago. They have started to rise. We have a bigger private rented sector, which has risen entirely opportunistically, and around that, we built other interventions like mid-market rent and the build-to-rent sector. But we don't really have a comprehensive view or an agreed picture. This is not something that comes from one individual. We need to be clear what we expect of our housing market, what the purpose of the various sectors are, and then how we intervene and support them to achieve that. And in particular around social renting, I think most people now regard social renting as some kind of welfare activity. It has never been that. It's a market intervention, because without social renting, without direct provision by the state, private market will produce slums in large numbers and expensive slums at that. And that is the evidence of history. So there's something about a more comprehensive understanding of what we're trying to achieve across the piece. And this bill and where we've ended up in the private rented sector have always been slightly kind of reactive attempts to fix part of a problem rather than a piece of a more comprehensive jigsaw, which is directed at creating a properly functioning balanced market in which folk have choice. And I'll stop there.
Can I ask John, really, it seems to be the relationship between rent and capital going into the markets, whether it's social rented sector, the private rented sector, the student rented sector, is quite a close one. And I think from what Tony was saying there, although we've seen increases in socially rented housing in the last decade, if you don't go 20 years back, but the last decade, you'll have seen that. You've seen a massive flight, really, of capital coming out of the markets, apart from, I would think, the student rented sector. So do you think that what would be the impact of this bill on the ability for more capital to be brought to bear to improve the rented sector?
I think what we would need to see in the private rented sector is greater investment, and that's about the number of units as well as what's invested in those individual units. I think that's really important. And my concern here is with this bill, we could see a disinvestment. We could see actually an encouragement for landlords to leave the sector. Now, there's two issues with that. One is about supply, and the other one is about the quality of the service that's offered to the tenants. And over the last few years, we have seen an increase in quality of both accommodation and service provided. But I'm the first to admit we need to see a higher quality, and that the private rented sector needs to deliver on that. And we can only do that as if we have people committed to providing the best service possible. And if we lose investors in the future, which I think this bill would encourage, then that's not good news for a vibrant, well-functioning private rented sector.
Yeah, my last question is for all three, but Gordon, first of all, if I can. There seems to be a bit of a consensus about the data element of the proposed bill, but on the issue about the appeal for a fair rents review, if you like, if I can call it that, what do each of you think it would mean in particular, as Alexander was mentioning, for the rural sector? I think there seems to be a consensus that it is a bit of a blunt instrument. It would perhaps even force rents up where they're not going up just now. But in particular, what do you think? I think I'm the only one on this panel that's not living in a city. What do you think would be the impact on the non-urban rural sector in particular of the appeal, being able to appeal for a market, a rent review, if you like? Mm-hmm. Gordon first.
So I think you're right that the what's before us at the moment is in some ways too blunt. And I think there are changes we could make, for example, to allow more nuanced approach in different areas that would go some way to address that. I would note that even this is significantly more nuanced already than the rent pressure zone metrics, and I think that's an important point. Now, on the ability to appeal rent levels, this is in effect just correcting what I would view as an oversight from existing legislation. It is currently the case that tenants can appeal rent. That's already in legislation. But the reason that, for example, we would never suggest our members do that is because both the rent officer and the tribunal has the ability to agree with the tenant and reduce the rent. They have the ability to disagree and leave it as it is. But they also have the ability, and the decisions on this are all publicly accessible, they also have the ability to increase the rent. And so that means that the current process is not one that tenants can have faith in. There's a real risk that they'll end up in a worse situation if they go through that process. And what this bill seeks to do is just change that so that the worst thing that can happen to a tenant who appeals their rent is that the appeal's not upheld, rather than ending up with a higher rent. Now, I think it was Tony that made the point about the quality of housing should be the minimum. It shouldn't be about incentivizing. Landlords shouldn't have the expectation that if they make what should be a very basic improvement, that they're then entitled to massively increase the rent. And I think that gets into some of the detail about this. Our view is that the relationship between rent and quality should be more of a stick than a carrot. That this should be a process where tenants can have recourse to force repairs to be made in a way that they currently don't. We speak to tenants all the time. I was speaking to a tenant this week who's gone 3 months without hot water and heating during the winter. And while there are, in theory, things in place for a tenant to seek redress for that, the reality is that they're extremely difficult, they're extremely slow. And what we find more often than not is tenants choose to just leave the property rather than go through months and months of waiting for the tribunal. And as we say in our submission to the committee, if this is done right, and if it's done made quick, then that could both be a way of ensuring affordable rents in urban areas where quality in non-urban areas, where quality is a particular concern, but also a really important mechanism for forcing up the quality in the private rented sector.
Just before going to others, can I just come back on that? Surely it must be the case, though, if you're talking about fair rents, it must be possible that somebody looking at it objectively can say what's being charged for rent is not sufficient for the landlord to be able to invest to the required standard. And it must be, if you're objectively saying it should be a fair rent, it must be able to go up as well as down, surely.
Sure, there's no shortage of mechanisms for the rent to go up. That's the problem here. Landlords are able to increase rent. Even in the proposals that are before us, it's extremely easy for landlords to increase rent, and there's very little recourse for tenants to do much about that. What there is a shortage of are mechanisms for tenants to bring the rents down to affordable levels. So while I agree, there will be situations where landlords are charging far less than what would be a market rent, but it's already possible for them to increase that. And I don't think that we need to strike that balance here, because it's already possible. What we do need is processes whereby tenants who are being charged unaffordable rents can do something about that, and that's what's missing.
And John, on the rurality, if I've still got time, convener.
Yeah, on you go.
So John, just on the issue.
Yeah, I think, sorry, if I may pick up.
John?
Sorry, I think the impact on the rural area, I think the internet connection's going there.
Yeah, it's specifically of the ability to appeal for a fair rent, that element of the bill that's proposed, and what impact that might have, what different kind of impact that would have in rural areas, perhaps from urban areas, if at all.
Yeah, well, I think it's similar across the board, and we have made a representation in the Commission about potentially this bill would stop any rent increases at all, and that's referenced in sections 22b5 and 6. So we have concerns about the impact that would have, and I would concur that the bottom line is that the landlord needs the rent to be able to invest in the property, and if that's curtailed in any way, then that will see a lack of investment in the property, and that's not good news for anybody. And I think there would be potentially a disproportionate effect on that in rural Scotland, simply because of the lack of supply.
Okay, Keith.
Yep, thanks.
Thank you very much. Gordon MacDonald.
Thanks very much, convener. I want to ask about data, but before I do, well, it's a point that was made earlier on about the lack of data. I can only talk about my experience representing Edinburgh constituency, and the Scottish Government's private sector rent stats for 2010 to 2019 highlight that in Lothian, private rent levels for a two-bedroom flat have increased by 46% over that 10-year period, when inflation was only at 29%. And the effect that has had is that in a two-bed flat in Leith is £420 a month if you rent it from the council, but if it's a private landlord with the same flat in the same block, it's £1,000. Now, we're also seeing the City Lets report, which came out on the 9th of February, that highlights across Scotland the rent rose for the year to December 2020 by 3.6%, at the same time as inflation was only 0.7%. And I'm just curious to know, what more data do we need before we do introduce some form of fair rents bill?
I think that's probably for you first, John.
Yeah.
I think, interestingly, in Edinburgh, what we're seeing is rents coming down, and that's been an issue over the last few months. So in the City Rents report, talks about a reduction of 4% in the last quarter, and I think potentially that could be more than that. But again, there is this differential between what's been marketed, what's achieved, and what is the passing rent for existing tenancies. So at the moment in the City of Edinburgh, landlords are struggling to let 1 and 2 bedroom flats. There's an oversupply, which is resulting in those market rents coming down. And that's how the market will operate, through supply and demand. Appreciate in the past there's been a greater demand in that area, and therefore rents have risen. So, and if that's the case, we need real data in the sense of to understand what are passing rents in the City of Edinburgh and indeed all over Scotland. We don't have that at the moment, but once we've got that, we'd be able to tackle the problem and work out what we actually need to do. But interestingly, as I say, within Edinburgh, which is the hotspot for rent increases in the whole of Scotland, rents are starting to come down. And that's for a number of reasons, and of course the pandemic has had a major impact on that. But people are moving out with their cities, generally across Scotland, into more rural areas. So again, we need to tackle that long term and understand why that's happening and what's that going to do for rents charged in more rural areas in Scotland. So I think that the data underpins and should underpin what legislation we introduce.
So in terms of that data, John, how would it be collected?
Well, certainly the report actually highlights
data. Sorry, what would the benefits be of collecting that data?
To understand the marketplace, so that we could actually see the majority of properties are not brought to the market, so we would never know what rents are actually being charged. We know landlord registration is a tool there where landlords have to register. They have to be able to go through various bits of information, have to provide that to the local authority to determine the condition of the property. There's prescribed information, questions they need to answer, and evidence they need to provide if requested by that local authority. And in addition to that, we could be asking them to provide information on the rents that they charge. In our submission, we talk about how it could actually be important to ask, have you increased rents since your last registration, i.e. 3 years ago? What was that rent? Because we don't know what that data was. What is the rent now? And that would, I hope, allow Rent Services Scotland to be able to collate that data and analyse it more thoroughly. So it'd be a tool to, as I said earlier, harvest the information. And we're lucky in Scotland we have landlord registration that can do that.
But if they're only having to put that information in at the time of registration or every 3 years when they re-register, that information will be out of date surely quite quickly, and therefore what use would it be in challenging any rent increase?
I think it would still be useful in the sense of Rent Services Scotland is asking for that same information at the moment. So they're going to landlords and asking now, and they would have asked the same information 2 years ago. So again, they're never going to have accurate, up-to-date information. But the point is it would be more information at the moment. So any information we get, I think, would be really useful.
Okay. Anybody else want to come in on that? Yeah, Gordon?
Yeah, so I think you raised an extremely good point. And it's, of course, important to note that the increases that you cite over the last years, you know, it's, in the CityLets report, they talk about it's a 7.3% increase over the last 12 months in Glasgow, 7.7% in South Lanarkshire, 8.6% on one-bedroom flats in Renfrewshire. And these are not just above inflation increases, they're above inflation increases during the time when tenants have faced some of the most difficult economic situations as a result of the pandemic. And while it is true that Edinburgh has had a very small decrease over the last few months, I think that's a product of Airbnbs temporarily being turned into flats, 10,000 odd of them, and a significant number of students. Edinburgh is, of course, a big student city. Students choosing to stay at home elsewhere. I think both of those things are very temporary, and I imagine rents in Edinburgh spiking back up massively. But the point that how much more data do we actually need is a really crucial one, because what we do know is that the sector is ballooning out of size, that the number of people in significant financial difficulty living in the sector is increasing dramatically, and that tenants are being put in really difficult situations. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation described private tenants in Scotland as the new face of poverty. And I think there's a real danger that we could always have better data, and that we spend years in pursuit of the perfect amount of data. All the while, tenants are being forced into further and further into poverty and desperate situations. And one of the products of what you described, the dramatic increases in rents in Scotland, is that tenants are then forced who are trapped in the private rented sector. If you're paying £1,000 a month in rent, as opposed to £400, £500 for a council flat, then you can't put any money towards savings. So that you could maybe put down on a deposit for a house to buy. When we talk about rebalancing the sector, affordable rents and tenants being able to put money aside is a crucial part of that. And I don't disagree with the point about investment in the sector. Clearly, that's important. But we do have a question to answer as to where should that investment be coming from. And currently, that investment is coming from, as we've heard, some of the poorest people in the country. And I think that's an intolerable situation. And as we come out of the pandemic, where tenants have seen their hours cut, they've lost jobs, they've spent all the what little savings they may have had. If we don't address these issues, then I think we face a very serious problem of poverty, of eviction from the private rented sector. And so our view is that this rebalancing, rent controls, more affordable housing in the private rented sector, has to be a part of our national recovery from coronavirus.
Okay, Tony, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, happily. I mean, there's quite a lot in there. The first one is in relation to the student market. Just to be clear, where students are renting from specialist providers at their institutions, this legislation will have no effect because they're not covered by the 2016 Act. They were excluded from statutory protection by the 2016 Act. So the Unites of this world, of the universities and the other specialist providers, will not be affected by this because those tenants don't have any statutory protection as things stand. That was withdrawn from them back in 2016, one of the issues that we raised at the time. But the other point to make is that all the figures that are being quoted here are asking rents, not passing rents or achieved rents. We don't have information on what is actually being paid in the sector. And I don't see the difficulty in requiring landlords to update the register when they change rents. Most landlords don't raise rents during tenancies. Average tenancy is less than a couple of years. Landlords adjust their rents when they relet properties. But what most landlords really want is tenants that stay long term and pay their rent. And they know that if they push the rent to the limits of the market, their tenants won't stay as long. The question that Keith asked about the impact in areas outside the cities, I suspect it won't have a lot of impact outside the cities. The risk is it'll push rents up. The likelihood is it'll make no difference. So, and it's back to that very nuanced nature of the housing market and the very partial coverage we currently have in terms of protections.
Okay, thanks very much, Convener.
Okay, thank you, Gordon. I'm going to let in Pauline McNeill here, who's the member who brought this bill forward. Pauline, if you've got a couple of questions for the committee.
Yes, thank you very much, Convener. Can I start by asking John, wonder if you could clarify, John, I thought you said earlier that if people couldn't afford rents in the private rented sector, then perhaps they shouldn't be renting there. So perhaps you could clarify that. And also, I wonder if do you acknowledge in any way that for many people living in the private rented sector, it's not a choice. There's a great deal of poverty, and the government's own statistics show that, in fact, Gordon MacDonald has already used those figures, but I'll just repeat them. So that Lothian and Greater Glasgow, so average rents increase above the rate of inflation between 2010 and 2019 across all property sizes. And the average private rents for two-bedroom properties rose double the rate of inflation. I mean, I wonder if you would acknowledge that that's quite a large part of Scotland, Greater Glasgow and Lothian, where rents have increased dramatically above. And if we do have high levels of poverty, how does that help tenants or landlords if people are at breaking point paying their rent?
I completely agree with that. And I think the point I was trying to make earlier is over the years, we've expected the private rented sector to pick up the slack from all the rented sectors in Scotland. So, and actually now we find some of the most vulnerable people living in the private rented sector. My point is, I don't believe that's the most appropriate place for them to be living. We should be having an affordable social housing sector which would best meet their needs, so that the private rented sector returns to become the sector of choice rather than last resort. And I think that's good for tenants, and I think that's good for landlords too. The point was made earlier, I don't think we've really had a proper strategy for the development of the private rented sector. What is its function in Scotland? What should it be doing? I'm pleased in the last few years the Scottish Government has tried to address that and set out what function it could provide. A lot more work needs to be actually done on that. So it's caught in a difficult place between the lack of supply in social housing and the lack of ability to be able to, for those who want to, become homeowners. So where else do people live? We need a vibrant, well-functioning rented sector in Scotland, of which the private rented sector is an important part of that. So I think we need to redress that balance, have a look at what do we want our private rented sector to do, and what service should it be providing long term.
So would you accept that until we achieve that, and I think there might be a consensus about more choice for all tenants who maybe want to, and surveys show that high percentage of people are in the private rented sector because they want to buy a property or they want to go on a waiting list for a source. But in that time, before we get these solutions, do you not agree that for some people rents are too high?
Certainly for some people it can be unaffordable.
Short term.
I certainly that, and of course, and for those people, you would argue they're forced to live in the private rented sector because there's nowhere else for them to go. What's interesting, and I'm sure you'll be speaking more about this later when you take evidence from Douglas Robertson, but in the report, the Shelter report, the evaluation on rent regulation, it does make an important point. It says that, rent controls are a useful stopgap. They're a breathing space, but they're not a long-term solution to the private rented sector and its growth and its development. So we need to really think long-term, not just short-term. And my concern is actually the short-term impact of this bill, and I appreciate what you're trying to do with the bill, but actually it could have completely the opposite effect. It could raise rents, where ordinarily they're not rising with sitting tenancies at the moment. We know through our evidence that's not the case. But actually we think what would happen is all this bill would do would be encourage landlords to raise rents.
Well, I could come to that question. So my next question, John, is why do landlords need to increase rent above inflation?
You've only got a certain amount of time. Just for clarification, are you going to be asking all your questions of John, or are you going to be asking the others?
John, yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. Just it's your time. I'm just asking.
Yeah, just the last one to you, John. I just wondered why do landlords need to raise the rent above the rate of inflation anyway? Because surely the rent level set in terms of the investment, in the whole picture, it just seems. We've got a picture across Scotland where rents in some places are just tripling the rate of inflation. So why do landlords need to do that? And if they are doing it, why shouldn't there be a cap on it?
I don't think inflation has any regard to what the landlord needs to invest in the property. That's the problem. So what they're actually investing is way and above inflation. The cost of, as you'll see in our submission, the cost of taxation, the cost of repairs and maintenance are way above any correlation with inflation. So any link to CPI, as suggested within the bill, is almost irrelevant to actually what landlords need to invest in the property. And we want to encourage landlords to invest. I don't want them to have an excuse to say, we can't invest in this property because there's not enough rental income. So it's about addressing that need for future investment in the property, which sadly and ultimately comes from rental income.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask Gordon Malone if he thought it was helpful to establish in law at least the principle that there should be rent controls. And I wondered, Gordon, if you, looking at, I know you've said quite a bit about rent pressure zones, would you agree that even if they were used, they don't give tenants any rights? It's clearly a power that local authorities can exercise. There's nothing in it which gives tenants any rights. I wonder, Gordon, if you would agree with that.
I would absolutely agree. And I think the point you made is a vital one. that it's all well and good for us to think long term and think about how we rebalance the sector and what's housing in Scotland going to look like in 20, 30, 40 years. The reality is that right now, there are tenants in Scotland being forced into absolutely impossible situations, having to choose between heating their home and feeding their family, being forced to rely on food banks. A study from Shelter showed that as many as 1 in 5 tenants now fear being made homeless as a result of COVID. So while we need long-term solutions, we urgently need a short-term and in the immediate term correction to the track we're on. I think rent pressure zones are insufficient. They don't go far enough, and that this bill is a significant and substantial step forward on that. Now, it's interesting you say the principle of establishing in law the principle of rent controls. In my view, the 2016 Act did that. It was an acknowledgement from the Scottish Government that the private rented sector and the market forces within it are not capable of delivering affordable housing. So it accepted that kind of in principle, but the policy mechanisms it put in place were totally insufficient to address that. We have cross-party consensus that the market on its own can't deliver that, and in fact, that's what housing benefit is there to recognise. So we talk about interference in the market. We already interfere in the market in big and dramatic ways, but we desperately need to go further, and I think this bill is an important step in that.
Thank you, Convener. I have no further questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, that completes our questions to our first panel, and can I thank you all for taking part today. Members of the panel can now leave the meeting by pressing the red telephone icon. I suggest a suspension of the meeting for the changeover of witnesses for 2 minutes. Thank you very much again to everybody who took part. Thank you. Welcome back, and I'm pleased to welcome our second panel of witnesses, who are Nina Ballantyne, Strategic Lead Social Justice Citizens Advice Scotland, and Professor Douglas Robertson, Consultant and Housing Researcher, Stirling University. Thanks for being in attendance today. We've allocated about an hour for this session. A lot of themes to get through, and you may have heard my remarks to the last panel, that if you agree with a panellist has already said, feel free to simply confirm this rather than give an answer. Members will again ask their questions in a pre-arranged order with any supplementaries at the end if time allows. And it would help broadcasting if members could indicate who in the panel their questions are addressed to in order, and if everyone could allow broadcasting a second to operate their microphones. Pauline McNeill is again in attendance for this session, and allow her to come in at the end for questions to panellists, time allowed. We now move on to the questions, and I will ask the same questions as I asked at the first panel, and that is, do you agree there's a need to bring fairness into the private rented sector to create a better balance of powers between landlords and tenants in Scotland? And Nina, I'll start with you if you don't mind.
I'd absolutely agree with that, and also just to say thanks to the convener for inviting Citizens Voice Scotland along today. I think what we see advising clients across the country is that there have been some improvements in legislation and intervention in the private rented sector, but the compliance and enforcement of what's there is really challenging. Is a kind of disproportionate weight on individual tenants who are in vulnerable positions to enforce their rights, and also to be well informed enough on their rights to kind of carry through the full process required. As such, I'd say we are supportive of the kind of principles and aims of this bill, but we're not convinced that in its entirety it will tackle more fundamental structural issues within the PRS and also with the housing sector overall in Scotland, as it is, unfortunately, it doesn't exist in a vacuum and is affected quite a lot by other factors outside the PRS as well.
Okay, thank you. Professor Robertson.
2016 bill to get a better balance, and I think that was achieved up to a certain point. However, there is always going to be an imbalance within the private rented sector. I think politically, economically, that's always going to be there. It's whether legislation wishes to improve that balance. Tenants are reluctant to challenge landlords. A recent work I've been involved with Indigo House, looking at the impact of the 2016 Act, shows that tenant the tribunal, landlords and agents go to the tribunal, they're represented by solicitors. Tenants who do go are not represented by solicitors. So even when they are trying to get an adjudication, shall we say, at the tribunal, there is a power imbalance there. And I'm not sure how much you can get around that, even with legislation.
Yeah, can I ask, do you think that the bill's proposals will help to reduce poverty and support low-income tenants and families? I mean, this one action alone, do you think this would help?
I'm concerned about the fair rent proposal of CPI plus 1%. That's been running within the social rented sector, generating quite significant surpluses, which the regulator is trying to stop housing associations and local authorities putting rents up, and why you would do the same within the private rented sector. It seems misplaced, given there are two areas in Scotland in particular where there seems to be a problem for high rents. One's central Edinburgh and the other one is the West End of Glasgow. Evidenced by RETI's recent material that John Boyle's put together shows that in the last 5 years we've had CPI plus 1%, so that's above inflation, in Glasgow, but in Edinburgh it's been CPI plus 2%. So actually, if you introduced this, it would really only be Edinburgh that you were looking at, and whether you needed national legislation to deal with a problem specific to one location. Having said that, again, drawing back on the research for the Nationwide Foundation, what is quite shocking, I think, is the rents are one thing, but what people can afford is another thing, if you like. And we're seeing that 12% are paying less than 20% of their income on renting. This is gross income. 30% are recording that they are paying between 20 and 30%, and 50% are paying more than 30% of their housing costs. That's 22% between 30 and 40%, and 21% of people are paying between 40 and 50, and unbelievably 8% are paying over 50%. However, only 11% of tenants think they find their rents difficult to pay, and I find that really, really, really peculiar.
Yeah.
You know, before
yes,
in social housing, over 25% of your income on rent was treated as a maximum. You can see by these figures that we're way over that. So the rents may not have increased, but the relationship between rents and what people are earning or able to is really out of kilter. So I don't think that addresses this issue. The fair rent proposals here, as called fair rent, would our CPI +1, that doesn't really take us to making housing affordable.
Yeah, thank you for that. Dana, can I ask, just if we turn that on its head, what evidence is there about the impact of rising rents causing affordability problems for tenants? I mean, do we have the data that backs up an opinion either way?
So there's been a lot of discussion around data so far in the committee, and I think it's fair to say that the PRS as a whole is something that is kind of a pretty murky world in terms of transparency. We don't really know what's going on there, whether it's rent levels, whether it's cases that should go to the tribunal that aren't, whether it's, you know, easily accessible information on tribunal decisions. That's all very difficult. And I think the difference between what this bill proposes, which we are in favour of, which is the rent register, compared to what exists, is that our information on rents in the PRS just now is based on a quote, it's only of advertised rents, and the advertised rents don't calculate what the rent is actually paid once the tenancy is signed, within tenancy increases. Properties, for example, that are let to kind of, you know, friends or family friends or through Gumtree and that more informal side of the market. So we're missing a big scale, but we do have data. We supported over 4,000 clients in the last 3 quarters with private rented sector issues, giving advice to. And we know that over the pandemic specifically, I think the PRS has actually been hit harder than other sectors. So we've got data on the amount of advice given on housing years through the Citizens Advice Network in Scotland. And what we can see is that although local authority rent arrears and registered other RSL arrears would typically make up the big portion of that advice, both of those have gone down over the course of the pandemic, and advice related to PRS arrears has gone from 6% to 14% over April to December 2019 to April December 2020. And that alone, I think, suggests that most PRS tenants are in a much more precarious position than other sectors. They've been hit harder by any change or any economic consequences.
Yeah, there's a feeling of lack of security in the private sector that there's not in the socially rented sector, isn't there? Can I ask then, do you think the power of Scottish ministers to vary the application of the fair rent cap would address any concerns about the CPI +1? And if so, when do you think that power should be used?
Our view on the CPI +1 is that for most tenants, it would only offer predictability rather than real affordability. So knowing that that's your maximum is great, but if your rent is already pushing the very limits of what you can afford every month, then we've mentioned actually city centre and kind of urban areas where rents are too high, but in a lot of rural areas, because of the lack of social housing, because of short-term lets, which hasn't been touched on yet and is actually a really crucial part of this we can talk about later, there is issues in affordability across the country. And if you're looking at rents that are already too high, saying that they're going to increase only a wee bit doesn't do much for those rents. And I think that the ability for ministers to change that would be a more positive step. But I think that one of the other real shortcomings with this is that it's a national issue for something that is very localised. Housing markets, I think, as Gordon MacDonald mentioned earlier, Leith rents are much higher in the PRS than they are in the social sector, but Leith rents are also much higher than Gorgie, just the other side of the city. So I think recognising that housing markets, there is no single Scottish housing market, it's very local, and I think using just one measure across the country doesn't recognise that nuance and would maybe not be as beneficial or effective as a more kind of regional local approach.
Does that suggest then that maybe the solution is to try and tighten up, to change, to make more workable the rent pressure zones?
So rent pressure zones' advantage is definitely the fact that they can be more local and more regional. But I think Gordon Maloney touched on some of the shortcomings there, where if there's no control on between tenancy increases, you don't necessarily kind of end the problem overall. And for all of this, when we're talking about a market that is not really a functioning market like any other kind of consumer area, there's huge constraint on the supply in housing in general and in the PRS, caused by long waiting lists for social housing, huge increase in short-term lets, increase in price of properties. I mean, really, if you think about tenants as consumers, if you want to treat the PRS in that way, they don't have meaningful choice in the sector. So there would be nothing to stop people putting properties on the market for the first time at extremely high rents and shifting up prices between tenants, and also incentivising landlords to get rid of tenants. So that if they feel they're not making enough money, they can increase that rent, and it would also potentially provide introduce barriers to tenants who do need to move, because they know that moving is when they're likely to see an increase in their rent.
Yeah, right, okay, thank you. Professor, have you got any quick comment on that? I have kind of overrun my time here.
One of the unintended consequences of the 2016 Act was to effectively introduce annual rent rises. You announced it 3 months before. However, again, looking at the research from the tenants and landlords' perspective, we're seeing, for example, that in terms of landlords, basically 60% don't increase the rent, it just stays the same. And tenants are saying that only a quarter are seeing the rent rise within the last couple of years. So as information about rents are basically bid rent, the Scottish Government's figures come from Rent Service Scotland. They are generated on broad housing market areas or the local housing allowance to fixed housing benefit. So it's a second-hand bit of data, and the majority of the data comes from websites, so it's bid prices. So we don't actually know what people are paying in rent. So all these figures that people have been quoting this morning, and myself, rent rises, are based on asking rents, not necessarily what rents are there. So again, back to the point in this legislation, I think it is fundamental, and any of the rent regulation mechanisms across Europe have to have decent information on the quality of the housing stock and its rents. And if the Scottish Government and politicians are passing legislation, surely they would want to know what impact that legislation is actually having. The legislation was sold on a basis of achieving certain aims. You have a data set in this area which is unable to provide information. And when you compare the amount of information that you've got in relation to social housing with private renting, it's massively different. Yet private renting is housing almost as many people as social housing. So there's a great imbalance in data. And one of the cuts, I think, that went through the Scottish Government was to reduce the quality of data. And therefore, how can you actually assess the impact of your legislation? It seems a very strange way to go about things.
Okay, thank you. Sarah, do you want to come in?
Yes, thanks very much, Convener. If I could just follow up that point with Professor Robertson, that was quite a clear comment that you've got a huge imbalance in terms of data between the PRS sector and the social rented sector. You've also got a huge imbalance in terms of rents, and it goes back to that point of what are the appropriate controls on the private rented sector, because the Scottish Association of Landlords would say leave it up to the market and then it'll just bottom out, however. But your opening comments to the convener about the percentage of people paying incredibly high percentages of their incomes, do we need a bit of a rethink, and what are the lessons from European countries who've got a different kind of approach that we could apply in Scotland in terms of rent controls, fairer rent, and rebalancing the system? In terms of your research, what would be your key findings that we should think about in terms of relation to this bill?
I think I've circulated the report we did on rent regulation, and it have to be said that rent regulation does not work. How you fix it is really a challenge. Ireland's a good example. They have had rent regulation around the Dublin housing market area and the Cork market area. But the problem is that if people want to pay the market rent, they quite happily abandon their rights to achieve that house. So if you have a concentrated market, and to be blunt, your committee discussed this a few weeks ago, short lets are an absolute disaster in terms of generating they take out demand and increase. We've got less private rented housing as a result. The reason prices are going down is short lets are coming back into the market, but that's not necessarily long term. Short lets in Skye, I was completely shocked by, is there is no rented housing available in Skye. From doing research on short lets for the Scottish Government, there was no homeless accommodation available in Skye. So, you know, the issue that you discussed earlier about short lets is quite a critical one. But are you, which doesn't look likely, going to limit short lets? And are you going to limit private rented property? It's a market solution. The issue, and again in our report for shelter that Gillian Young and myself were commissioned to do, the issue is you need to provide more housing, and that needs to be social housing. We've got a very peculiar market situation in private renting where 31% of tenants want to move into an occupation. Whether they can is another question, and 23% want to go into social rent. So you've actually got a tenure which the majority of people don't want to be in. And that's a very unusual situation. I don't think you've got that either in non-occupation or council housing. So post the financial crisis and all the changes that happened from 2008 onwards, private renting appeared overnight. And then subsequently, we've seen short lets appear. And, you know, you'll know yourself, Sarah, from your constituency area, that is a massive change. Now, these things are happening really, really quickly. I think we need to have a more stable, and back to Tony's point and other people's point, what is the housing strategy of the Scottish Government, and what do we want to achieve? In the crisis following 2008, the private rented sector was used, as John Blackwood said, it's not suited for a lot of people, and I think a lot of the affordability points I made earlier, which shock me, you know, people paying my daughter pays 50% of her gross income on rent. You know, that's quite ridiculous. Now, her rent's £500 shared with her partner, and she's, you know, anyway. But what you see there is that for certain people, it's a massive amount. They see it as temporary, they see it as acceptable, but it's clearly not a housing solution. You know, we need a better understanding. But my problem with this proposal on CPI plus 1% is this will just inflate all rents. The majority of these rents are below that, and I think that's a serious issue. The issues around getting better data so we better understand the market, and then we can interfere. My other problem, I have to say, is rent pressure zones were designed not to work. They are cynical policy. I spoke to Margaret Burgess, the Minister, when I was doing the shelter report, and she was quite happy not to include them, as was Alec Neil. The Scottish Government made a commitment to have them, so they introduced them, but there is no intention of these working. You know, the data requirements are way beyond what anybody can do. So if you want something as a stopgap, you could maybe look at making the rent pressure zones, you know, fix the rent when the property and limit it to a certain rise. But as I say, they did that in Dublin, and people just said they didn't ask. If you were a tenant in Dublin, you did not ask what the previous rent was, because if you did that, the tenant would not allocate, because then you would be expecting to know what the rise had been from the previous rent. So people didn't ask what the previous rent was, so the whole rent regulation mechanism was caught because people, and the same things happened in Berlin, same things happened in Paris, same things happened in Lyon. People, when there is a pressurised market, people will abdicate their rights to secure the property. That's the nature of a market system.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the challenge is, what would be the change? And is there anything in this bill that would be helpful? And what other mechanisms could we use? Can I could push that point on to Citizens Advice Scotland? James is looking at me, so that means that I think Professor Robertson has used all my time allocation, but it was very, very useful feedback, so that is not a criticism. So just a brief question to Citizens Advice Scotland about tenant rights. There are clearly people in private rented accommodation who'd rather be somewhere else, but they genuinely have no choice. So in terms of Citizens Advice Scotland, the elements of this bill that you think would be helpful, and anything else you think that would be good short-term measures to address what's clearly a systemic problem?
So definitely don't want to throw the baby out the bathwater in this bill. The Red Register is vital, and I would maybe suggest a version of the Red Register that has slightly more information, and crucially for all the information that landlords submit on their properties to be publicly accessible. What Professor Robertson just mentioned there is that tenants had no way of checking previous rents or weren't confident enough to check previous rents. If that information is available for tenants to peruse when they're checking if their landlord is registered, for example, and also for organisations like ourselves or like Scottish Government or members of the Parliament to see as well and be able to get a more accurate assessment of what's going on, as opposed to it just being the register managers who have access to that information. And democratising that would be vital, I think, as a foundation for better policy and better affordable housing policy across all tenures, not just as social housing to improve affordability in housing overall. I think rent controls are something that could make a real difference for Citizens Advice Bureau clients, but as I think Professor Robertson was touching on, only if we make sure that the other elements at play are kind of suitably managed as well. So short-term lets regulation is vital. And what we saw, part of the reason for the massive growth in short-term lets is not just the facilitation provided by organisations like Airbnb, but it's also some landlords looked at the new PRT, and even though it was pretty mild and not very radical, thought actually there's not really any requirements for me to do anything in the short-term let market. So it's an easier move, it's more money, and it's less. There's less burden in the short-term lets, and that's an easier move. So unless we tackle that and make short-term lets and long-term lets seen as kind of some sort of parity in terms of the effort required by landlords there, I think that's really important. Again, we've got, I think, something like 150,000 people on waiting lists across Scotland for social housing. That has to be addressed as well, but that's a longer-term fix. It takes a certain amount of time to get new properties into the social sector. But I think those two issues we have to tackle this same time as thinking about rent controls for them to be sustainable and work the way that I think this bill would intend to.
And would it help rebalance power to tenants? We've heard a lot of evidence in the committee over recent months about what it means when you go to a rent tribunal, or tenants not even feeling confident that they're going to be listened to and they're going to be up against lawyers. Are there things that relate to this bill that you think could be useful? I think there's limited content in this bill that really tackles that imbalance for challenging a landlord. There's a lack of funding for housing advice, specialist housing advice in Scotland, and obviously we could always say that as an advice organisation. We know there's demand out there that we're struggling resource-wise to meet, but even if it's not us delivering that advice, tenants on their own will struggle to follow through all the information and processes required at the tribunal. They can do that if they do have access to advice and support, but many of them don't. They certainly have in most instances, whereas letting agents and landlords more often do have professional representation at the tribunal. And I think it's a small point, but something we've talked about whether there's space for improved education, even at school leavers. We know that people in the PRS tend to be younger, they're inexperienced, they're less confident in their rights, full stop. You're a landlord, your rights and responsibilities as a tenant, as a school leaver, as part of the kind of range of other essential skills would be possible to help create a kind of generation of confident renters there.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Alexander?
Thank you, Convener. The panel probably heard that in the first panel I asked, I was trying to ascertain the issues that we have between the urban and the rural. And Professor Robertson, you gave us some indication today that there are dramatic issues with rented accommodation across some of the rurality. You gave Skye as an example there, where it wasn't possible for that to be the case. So can I ask a similar question? How do you think this bill will help the rural side of things to ensure that they do end up having a supply within this process?
I think this bill would do that. It would increase the rents beyond what they are already, so it would go against, again, it's one of these unintended consequences. CPI plus 1%, as I said, is generating surpluses in the social housing sector, which the regulator of social housing is concerned about. It is also, it's way above what the overall rent rises have been across Scotland for the last 5, in fact 10 years, with the exceptions of a few hotspots. The problem we've got is that we don't have the data at a small enough scale, which was desired for the rent pressure zones, to be able to pin down the rents. You know, for example, I'll quickly give you the Rent Service Scotland data, which the Scottish Government uses, as we've already heard, is basically bid price data, what people are asking. The average rent currently in Lothian is £969 for a 2-bedroom property. In Edinburgh, it's 1,134 if you go to Retties. So you can see that these broad housing market areas, the government data actually hides certain rent rises. But the average rent in the Ayrshires, for example, is £469 for a 2-bedroom property, and the average for Scotland is £798. So you can see there are massive variations in the rents charged for the same size of property in different locations, and therefore there will be problems in specific areas. Skye, because of short lets, you know, creating the disappearance of the private rented sector. But similarly in Fort William, which is not necessarily rural, but it had the same problems. You know, the post office was intermittent, students couldn't get accommodation, so couldn't go to colleges. The college staff couldn't get accommodation. The smelter could not get the work carried out because workers couldn't come in to rent accommodation to do the smelter work. You now see that the smelter work is progressing because Airbnbs are not working. So you can see that the housing market situation in rural areas is much more intense. The focus has been on Edinburgh, but in other places it has been intense. This is a new player in the rented market system. So if you are basing your housing strategy on markets, then this is what's going to happen. I do have a problem, I have to say, where people say we have no housing, we need more housing built. At the same time, they're renting out housing which is surplus to their requirements to make money. Now, that's a political decision you guys need to deal with. You know, is it acceptable for public money to be spent building new houses where there are houses currently being used as short lets? If schools go, if local facilities cannot be supported, shops, post offices and the like, you know, you are the arbiters of some of these decisions. But I do think this bill, in terms of the information, I think is fundamental, and it's very, very good. In terms of the so-called fair rent, it's not a fair rent. It would actually be inflationary in terms of rent.
And you identify that, you know, if this bill is progressed and goes forward at some stage, that it could have a much more detrimental effect on some of these communities that are really hanging on by their fingernails to try and support the communities that are there with schools and facilities and amenities in that process. So I think, you know, and you also talked about earlier, Professor Robertson, about, you know, that in the landlord situation, many, I think 60% you said, do not increase their rent on a long-term tenancy. And that, once again, must have an impact about how the rent process is managed and what we can see developing from that. It's the short term, it's the 1 or 2 year rent issues that are the problem, and they are exacerbating the whole sector, it would appear.
Well, we're taking our rent information from bid prices, and we're not taking it from what rents are actually being charged. We do need to get that information. The suggestions here about landlord registration and putting the rent, some more details and information about the quality of property will give us a better insight. But at the present, we are basing it on a system that was designed for a completely different purpose, which was to fix the local housing allowance for housing benefit purposes. It's not a housing system, it's basically a benefit system that we are using to try and assess. And again, we did a critique of the data collection for Rent Service Scotland, which fed into the Scottish Government's data. And I note that in the recent publication, the Scottish Government has accepted these criticisms that these are bid rents and they are from large areas, and most of the extra information they generate are taken from the same websites. So it's CityLets. And again, CityLets is a business which obviously is collecting information, but it's looking for people to invest, if you like, in renting. So it's the high point rents that we're looking at, not what people are actually paying.
And, you know, so councils, you identified that, you know, the private landlord registration scheme. Now, that is administered by the councils within the local areas. And some councils, in evidence, have suggested that the additional workload that would be required would require to have some funding mechanisms there to ensure that that was managed effectively, to ensure that they had the database and to hold that information. But if the councils are having an issue with that themselves, how are we going to manage to square that circle?
If you're filling in the form, it's just a matter of entering that data into the system. The councils administer landlord registration, but it is all, the data is then centrally held. They feed into a centralised system. I don't really see it's a particular problem. They already charge landlord registration fees. You know, so the fees.
Yeah, it's not something you identify as an issue of concern, although, as I say, some of them have raised it.
No.
Okay. Thank you, Convener.
Okay. Right, thank you, Alexander. Gordon?
Thanks, Convener. Before I start asking my questions, can I just ask for a point of clarification from Professor Robertson? You've mentioned a couple of times about bid prices as what a lot of the private rented data is based on. Can you tell me what you think the relationship is between a bid price and what the actual rents paid? Are you suggesting that the actual rent paid could, in many cases, be a lot higher than what the bid price is?
No, the rent that is being asked may be achieved. And in Edinburgh, I presume, and especially in Leith, I would imagine these rents are the rents that are charged. But that's only a very small proportion of properties that are coming on the market. The average tenant stays in their house for 2.5 years. So a significant proportion, 60% of these tenants, will not see a rent rise over that 2.5-year period. Some will. So again, the rents will be lagging behind these bid prices. So what the Scotland data gives you the high rent. We're not sure if they necessarily get these rents in other locations. In the Ayrshires, if your rent is £490 odd, I'm not sure you'd be able to get £490 rent for a house in Leith, but you can see there that people probably may want a higher price, but they'll not get it. So again, I think the rents that some people are paying these rents, but other people are certainly not. So it's trying to understand what rents are actually being charged before you actually can say how high they are. The other issue is on the counter is that people are on low incomes. So it's not just the rent that's being charged, it's a bigger issue about the level of poverty and in-work poverty that's causing these problems. And as usual, it's the low-income single parents, black and ethnic minority groups who are people that struggle within this market system.
Thanks for that. I wanted to ask about the fair open market rent section 2 of the bill, and we've talked a lot about rent levels. And to start with, Nina, I'm keen to understand what information you guys have got from people you've represented about poor conditions of property, failure to meet the repairing standard, and poor energy efficiency. Is there any data on the conditions of a lot of these rented properties?
Yes, within private rented sector advice in the Citizens Advice Network in Scotland, usually repairs and maintenance would be the kind of biggest area of advice, and that is almost always, when you look at the actual detail of the cases, to do with blatant non-compliance by the landlord. It's not that the legislation on that side is, insufficient. It's just that the tenants are finding it impossible to enforce. And I think, we see that not just as an urban issue as well, rural areas too, and it's really concerning. And it's not just that the landlords, once someone is fully informed of their rights, they are supported to go through the tribunal. That takes quite a long time as well. And I think the tribunal, the House and Property Chamber, said that they had way beyond anticipated number of cases to deal with in their first year, and obviously there'll be backlogs from the pause over the past year, the pandemic. So additional resources for the tribunal, the time taken to get anything actually changed. And it's even more basic than that. Just in December, we had a case where an advisor was helping somebody with rent arrears that had arisen as part of the pandemic, and as they were helping with the case, they realised the landlord wasn't even registered. And that's been years now, and I think there's a lot of discussion around making sure that landlords are informed and supported to meet all their obligations, because, there are some, but that kind of level of non-compliance is really inexcusable, and the fact that it's all on a tenant who is in a vulnerable situation, risking the roof over their head, to challenge is really quite difficult. And I think that would come into play when we're talking about fair rents as well. And I think the criteria are sensible in terms of what might help qualify for a rent reduction, but there's no indication that the starting level to reduce rents from would actually be fair or affordable anyway. So if there is nothing wrong with the property, how do we judge then, is the rent fair or not? And the market rate, as discussed, has been distorted by short-term lets and other constraints on supply.
Okay, thanks for that. And back to Professor Robertson, you've given us a paper about experience in Europe that we've already referred to. Can you say what happens in other countries in regard to the quality of private housing stock? Private rented housing stock, I should say.
Yeah, Gordon, I think the important thing, everybody likes looking at European examples, but obviously the culture is very different. I think what I tried to show in that is that certain areas have a long tradition of rent control, and they did not see, they had a very different arrangement, whether it's France or Germany or the best example is probably Sweden, where it was very much a social democratic, and the rents would be determined on quality standards and they would be fixed, and whoever was providing that would only be able to charge that rent. I don't think we're there here at all. So in a sense, when you look at other cultures, there's only a limited amount that we can get from that. The Irish example, given they've had a similar history, have a similar legal system, I think shows they're coming into it from a very free market basis and trying to introduce some form of rent regulation. And that's just been an ongoing battle. It's been highly problematic. And the arrangements that they've put in place, they have good information. I think the Scottish Government took a lot of advice from the Irish Government in terms of how you have a mediation service. I think we have some challenges in terms of dealing with the tribunal. It still seems very legalistic for tenants to get resolution of certain matters. But in terms of the fundamentals about rent control, unless you have good information, which is telling you what's going on and being able to fix certain figures, and I think that's the big problem in probably a lot of policy areas where the Scottish Government do not have good information. So I don't know how you can judge some of these policies and the rent restriction zones asking for a level of information which is way beyond what the Scottish Government controls themselves, would suggest that there is a big move to try and improve our understanding of the quality and the rents, and we now know at least who the landlords are, but that I think has taken 20 years.
Okay, thanks very much, Convener.
Thank you very much, Gordon. And Keith?
Thanks, Convener. Just on that last point first, if I could, I'm trying to, as a member of the committee, pick my bones through what might be worth going forward, given the evidence of witnesses today in this bill. And the most obvious piece seems to be around data. And I'm kind of struggling to understand, and it's probably just my ignorance of the field, but is it surely possible to have, through both technology and legislation, if it's done smartly, a completely up-to-date data source which gives you rents, actual rents, when they're paid, when they're changed, even conditions of houses which are being rented? Surely that's not a hugely difficult process to achieve. To both witnesses, if I could. Professor Robertson first.
Landlord registration, electronic data, you're right, or if the tenancy deposit scheme collects information, you could have information there in terms of housing quality. But it's about finding which one is the best one to do that, and then ensure that the data is live. Yes, absolutely. I don't see the problem. For example, I suppose 40 years ago, I think I was working for Glasgow City Council, campaigning for a housing survey, the house condition survey, and we got a national house condition survey. I noticed that we're now using only 3,000 cases to actually carry out that survey, and I think we've seen some things in terms of quality veering quite significantly. We've now got a survey which is so short because of cutbacks in resource. I think the Scottish Government has to accept that we need to have decent information. It's what drives everything. And across Europe, I think if you look at the rent setting models that they have in different countries, they're all predicated on a far better data set. We are using a second-hand data set, which was for welfare benefit reasons, to try and make some assessment of rents in Scotland. That's not good enough. And for the Scottish Government to have carried through a very substantial set of reforms on private renting, but have no idea, from the official information that we have, how that's gone, seems negligent, to be honest.
And citizens' advice, Nina?
Yeah, I'd agree with Professor Robertson that there's no reason we couldn't have it live. We know that the burden, such as it would be, would only be maximum anyway, because that's already in the kind of legislation that you can only increase it in every 12 months. And I don't see why we couldn't have, at the same time, you need to give your tenants notice of 3 months of any rent increase, that couldn't then be also given to the registration, whatever register this is, at the same time. I think that's completely feasible. And it would be, I think, much more useful than the system we have just now, which Professor Robertson has mentioned, doesn't capture accurate kind of real-time rents, and there'll be rents above the bid price, there'll be rents below the bid price, there'll be changes within tenancies that we're just not seeing at the moment. And so we're kind of making policy in the dark to an extent.
Thanks very much. So on that part of the bill, the conclusion I would draw is that we could aim a bit higher than is currently proposed and in a more comprehensive way. But on the other parts of the bill, I'm looking at Professor Robertson's report as well. You say at one point in the conclusions and recommendations, ultimately it's supply side policies embracing both land use and financing new social rented housing that will have a much bigger and more positive impact on the affordability issues impacting on lower income groups within society. Given that and all that we've heard about how some of the measures, proposed measures in this bill would actually increase rents pretty much across the board and have such a limited impact on one or two areas, Are we better looking at other solutions to this, or do either of the witnesses think there are other parts of this bill which we should retain because they alleviate the situation just now? Professor Robertson first.
Yeah, I think the supply of new social housing, I think this was a conclusion reached in 1917, that the private market failed to provide decent housing for the working classes was their conclusion. We seem to have come back to that conclusion here, that there are certain people who are not well housed within private renting. The problem is, of course, back to rents, there is an interesting situation currently that tenants of social housing, whether housing associations or local authorities, are paying higher rents as a result of CPI plus 1%. And these surpluses are being used now to build the new council houses. I think in the case of housing associations, it's 30%, local authorities 50%. Tony Kane will know the figures better. But it does seem a strange situation that the poorest within society are contributing to building new houses, and that's why their rents are high. So there is a much more fundamental about how we actually fund the housing system that needs to be considered. We've gone down a particular road, and we need to, I think, have a much bigger review. The stopgap of using private renting to house certain people is not there. And the issues in the private housing market, the demise of owner occupation and people being able to buy into owner occupation, we need to actually have a look at that as well. So I don't think the fair rent proposals here will help. Whether you want rent regulation in hotspots, then that means you want to go back to the rent pressure zones. Glasgow University, I think, to your committee where you were looking at COVID, was suggesting that perhaps you, within these smaller areas, have the rents registered and then an increase of a certain percentage. But again, when I look at the Irish, the Berlin, the Paris, the Lyon, any major European city just now, tenants who want these properties will not use their rights, because the market system means that if they have the money, they can get that property. So it doesn't really protect certain people, and it does result in people being forced out of these hotspot areas because the landlords see the opportunity to get other tenants in. So in fact, they may add to the problems rather than distract from the problems. So maybe the previous administration's view that rent pressure zones weren't a particularly good idea may in fact be the case.
And the same, thanks for that. And the same point to Nina Ballantyne, just as to whether, other than the data side of things, there are things in this bill which should be taken forward, even if they were to be amended or changed.
I think that the intent to achieve more affordable housing in Scotland, including in the PRS, is a good one. I think the measures in this bill will probably not achieve it in the short term because the PRS doesn't exist in a vacuum, and the issues with short-term lets, for example, not only are the financialisation of the sector and the shortage of social housing will mean that it won't be as effective as we'd hope. And I think that the key thing that this bill has brought to light, which is actually really helpful though, and I would hope that we can see kind of further progress on this in the next Parliament, is being able to better understand the difference between a fair rent, a market rent, and an affordable rent. At the moment, the market is distorted in the PRS because of all the factors we've discussed about. So a market rent, I don't think we can say is really a fair rent, in the same way Tony Kane earlier talked about the market being unbalanced so that rents weren't fair. And then a fair rent, as described in this bill, wouldn't actually lead to affordable rents, because affordability isn't just related to the cost of something, the rent you're paying, it's also based on how much income you have going in. So whether, even in the social sector, for example, if your rent is at the higher end of the social sector, but you're on a very low income, your rent officially might be categorised as affordable, but to the tenant, it actually might not be that affordable. And so I think I'm hopeful that this bill, as well as the data point, can help really inform better policy making in future and drawing out the evidence from witnesses today and from other areas that those three things, fair rents, market rents, affordable rents, are actually different, and we need to get better at deciding what we're actually trying to pursue and the best mechanism to do that.
Okay, thank you to both witnesses. Thanks.
Thank you, Keith. I'm now going to bring in the member who brought the bill forward, Pauline McNeill, to ask a couple of questions. Pauline.
Thank you very much, Convener. I'd like to firstly ask Professor Robertson. So John Blackwood said that CPI +1's not enough, and you've given evidence you think it's too much and you think there'll be unintended consequences. And may commend the excellent report, which I did read at the weekend in partnership with Indigo. And in that report, which you've said to the committee, acknowledges that 40 to 50% people are paying 30% of their income on rent. So I just wondered, what action would you suggest as an alternative, or not at all? Or is there any short-term recommendations that you would like to suggest to the committee to address this?
The big issue, CPI +1% has been a higher benchmark than the markets right across Scotland, with the exception of Glasgow, Edinburgh, and certainly Aberdeen was there, but Aberdeen's collapsed over the last few years. Aberdeen's a very low rent area now. So there's a volatility going on within. The issue is really about poverty, Pauline. I think you probably know that the rents are fixed at a certain level, but it's who can afford it. And is our welfare system up to supporting people on rents? And if people are in low-paid employment, I have to say I do find the affordability figures that study is throwing up. As I say, I am quite shocked at the fact that people do not see. Only 11% of tenants think their rent is not unaffordable, if you like. So I think we really do have to tease out what do we mean by affordability. And I think all of us are dealing with a very blunt instrument. 20 or 30 years ago, we said that over 25% of your gross income paid on rent in the social sector would be unaffordable. We're way above that, really. But we're also way above that within the social rented sector. We've used the social rented sector as a cash cow to support local government. And now, as I say, it also supports Scottish Government in terms of building new council houses. Is it right that the poorest in society are paying?
Any action? Would you propose any even short-term action to address that?
Well, you have to provide more housing somehow, or you improve your welfare system so that people are not subjected to that. But I think we're dealing with a blunt instrument. The rents are the rents because that's where the market is at, if you like. Whether people can afford the rents is a fundamental position of where their financial position is. I think that's the trouble, is we've not got an understanding of, we use the word and we band it about affordability all the time. But what is affordability? If I go back to my old housing association days, I see it as 25% of your gross income. I'm not seeing that registered either in housing associations today, local authorities today. So in effect, the poorest people have become poorer as a result. The great benefit of our housing system, and again, using Mark Stevens' research at Glasgow, was that we used housing as a means to subsidise poverty. We kept rents down and we allowed people to have a good quality of housing, and they weren't paying too much. That was part of the old arrangement that we had. From 1988, where we broke with that idea and we created a market system for private renting, and we didn't restrict in the social rented sector, we have a system whereby housing is expensive and it is creating poverty as opposed to alleviating poverty. And I think the only way you can deal with that is to put resource into providing new housing to undermine the market position that currently exists. As I say, that was the solution in 1919. I don't think it's changed.
But you wouldn't be proposing any action at all on capping rents. You wouldn't propose any action.
I think the evidence does not suggest that that works. I would like to say the opposite, but looking at the evidence of rent restrictions across Europe, I think countries that have had a long tradition of rent restrictions, Denmark, Sweden, Germany, I think the rents are better and more affordable, but they're able to determine that because they then can make a judgment, and traditionally they made a judgment about the quality of house, and then they fixed the rent for that quality of house, and the landlord had to accept it. I'm not sure we're in a position to do that. If we have the data, I would argue for that system, make an assessment of the quality. I think under the 1965 Act, it was called the Fair Rent System, and I think that worked reasonably well. But I don't think the proposal here is a fair rent system. I think we need to have information about housing quality and then determine the rent on that basis. That would be a good system. And landlords could be involved, obviously, landlord, John's organisation could be involved. But does that necessarily get over the issue that a significant number of people are extremely poor and they need accommodation? This is not the housing solution for them.
Polly?
Okay, I just wanted to press Professor on that, but so you wouldn't be proposing to take any action then. Could I ask Nina, so you've said to the committee that you think a local approach is better, but would you acknowledge that rent pressure zones haven't worked and they don't really give tenants any rights? And if I could just quote some figures, I mean, it isn't just, high rents isn't just Glasgow and Edinburgh. I mean, 2-bedroom properties on last year's figures, we've got, so Greater Glasgow is £780 a month, East Dumbarton is £677, Aberdeenshire is £652 a month, and West Lothian is £630 across Scotland in their last year's figures. So I just wondered how you think that, if you don't support a national approach, how do you think a local approach could work then?
So in our own submission, the most recent one in relation to the bill, I think we said quite explicitly that high pressure markets are not confined to Edinburgh, Glasgow or kind of previously Aberdeen. Advisors have told us that there tends to be fewer social lets in rural areas, which increases demand on the PRS stock. There are higher concentration of holiday homes often, and there are many homes tied to employment in more rural areas as well. And there tends to be less investment in new affordable homes in rural areas too, all of which contributes to higher rent. So we'd absolutely recognise that it's not an issue that's confined to any one particular corner of Scotland, but the scale and the solution, I think we do have to recognise might be slightly different in different places because of the factors I just mentioned. And while I absolutely agree that rent pressure zones are not a panacea either, the one advantage they do have is the opportunity to influence rents on a more local basis. That doesn't, I think, negate all the other criticisms I said earlier and the challenges with the current rent pressure zones, but I do think an approach that can take account of local factors will be required to make rent controls sustainable. Does that answer the question, or is there any more on that?
Convener, or just finally, Nina, just a yes or no answer. So does that mean that you would support, albeit on a local basis, you still support the concept of having some caps on high rents?
Yes, but I'm going to just say one caveat, which is the short-term lets regulation. I think that the huge swing we saw from long-term lets to short-term lets over the last 10 or 20 years, it has to be tackled alongside. Otherwise, what you see is, again, short-term further constraint on supply in the PRS, which won't solve any of the issues. If we can bring more parity between short-term lets and long-term lets, that'll be really important if we're thinking about this just as a market. Otherwise, I think we do risk seeing properties taken off the market, which in the long term is no bad thing. If they become social housing, if they become owner-occupier properties, that's fine. But while we're still trying to recoup the losses in social housing, I think that's something we've got to bear in mind, is make sure that the short-term lets regulation is in place and suitable, and also recognising that income is a factor. So social security and wages also affect affordability too.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Pauline. Thank you very much to both our witnesses. That completes our questions and concludes this evidence session. Again, thank you for taking part in the meeting today and helping identify some of the key issues in relation to our scrutiny of this bill. Our next evidence session is on the 3rd of March with the Minister for Local Government Housing Planning, and then with Pauline McNeill, the member in charge. I will now suspend briefly to allow a witness changeover and suggest that we suspend for around 5 minutes. Thanks again to everybody. Bye. At agenda item 3, the committee will consider the European Charter of Local Self-Government and Corporations Scotland Bill at stage 2. Our fellow committee member, Andy Whiteman, is the member in charge of the bill and will move and speak to his amendments. I'm also pleased to welcome the Cabinet Secretary for Communities and Local Government, Aileen Campbell, to move and speak to amendments on behalf of the Scottish Government. Some brief comments before we begin, as these are our first remote stage 2 proceedings. I will take things a little slower than I would normally, particularly when it comes to disposal of amendments after a debate. If you wish to object to an agreement of an amendment, that's to say if you want to put it to a vote, please raise your hand when I call that amendment so as to register your objection. That will hopefully be captured in the gallery view of proceedings. However, to be sure of this being noted, I also suggest you type object or no in the chat box. I will pause to take note of whether anyone has objected in this way. If there are any votes on amendments, I will call the vote alphabetically by roll call to aid recording and transparency. I will put the question on the amendment and ask each member in turn whether they agree, disagree or abstain with the amendment, with my vote being recorded last. I will then read out the result. Interventions in someone's speech are as ever permitted, but bear in mind that it's harder to catch the speaker's attention in a remote debate, and broadcasting needs to catch up as well. So overall, I'd encourage you not to intervene if you have the option of instead making your point in a short speech. I will call those who have amendments being considered today in the usual order. If any member wishes to contribute to a debate in a grouping, even where they don't have an amendment, please catch my attention by typing R in the blue jeans. We now move on to consideration of amendments. Section 1, interpretation of the Charter articles. I call Amendment 1 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary in a group on its own. Cabinet Secretary to move and speak to Amendment 1.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Committee. And before I start with the detail of Amendment 1, I would just like to extend my thanks to Mr Whiteman and his team for the discussions and collaborative work that has been done in the lead up to this point at stage 2. It has been really helpful, and I think the amendments that we're both putting forward will lead to an improved bill, subject, of course, to the Parliament and Committee's agreement. So on to the first amendment. Amendment 1 is an important one which needs some explanation. Amendment 1 ensures that the Charter is applicable subject to any reservations, objections or interpretive declarations by the UK. And this is important because, as it stands, the bill does not reflect the 2 declarations made by the UK in relation to the European Charter of Local Self-Government. The first declaration provides that the Charter applies to councils in Scotland under the Local Government Scotland Act 1994. This is mentioned by the member in the policy memorandum to the bill. This is useful in ensuring that the bill does not apply to any other bodies which exist or might be established in future that have functions that are similar to those of local government. Currently, the best potential example in Scotland might be the second declaration simply provides that the UK considers itself bound by all the paragraphs of Part 1 of the Charter in accordance with Article 12. This declaration reflects the main new structure of the Charter. The effect of the amendment is to simply ensure that incorporation exactly mirrors the UK's international obligations in relation to the Charter. Neither of the declarations impact on the policy aims of the bill, and neither does this amendment, but it is necessary to ensure that the bill is compatible with the UK's international obligations. The policy intention of the bill is to achieve the incorporation of the Charter into domestic law in Scotland, to give it legal effect and allow compliance with the Charter to be enforced in the Scottish courts. This amendment will ensure that this intention is fulfilled. Inclusion of reference to the declarations is consistent with incorporation and would avoid any potential for confusion. Without such an amendment, there may be an argument that the bill is not compatible with international obligations. As such, there would be a risk that the bill could be challenged under Section 35 of the Scotland Act 1998.
Can I apologise? But I've been told that the first amendment should be Amendment 17. So I'm going to suspend for a second to get this sorted out. Suspend the meeting.
I apologise if I
Cabinet Secretary, would you like to come back in?
Thank you, Convener. And given the necessity to explain the rationale behind this amendment, I'm just going to go a wee bit and repeat a wee bit of what I said just before we were cut off. So, without this amendment, there may be an argument that the bill isn't compatible with international obligations, and as such, there would be a risk that the bill could be challenged under Section 35 of the Scotland Act 1998. That would prevent the bill from being submitted for royal assent, and this amendment removes that risk. The amendment also deals with other risks. The UK is a party to the Charter and not Scotland. It is therefore an international obligation of the UK. The subject matter of international relations is reserved to the UK Parliament by the Scotland Act. We can make some laws in this area, such as this bill, but if we didn't pass this amendment and the UK departs from the terms of the treaty at some point in the future, then it presents some risks, and we're still bound by international law to comply with the Charter under the terms set by the UK, but we would have this Act which now says something different, and this is an issue that would need to be resolved. If within devolved competence, the Scottish Parliament could legislate, but what if it's not within devolved competence? It might not be as simple as amending the Act to make it compliant with the terms set, should we wish to do so. This amendment removes these risks. It provides for a flexible approach incorporating the Charter and gives effect to the treaty in accordance with the UK's international obligations. Finally, to say that this type of provision is not unusual. For example, this amendment is similar to the provision included as Section 1.3 of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and Corporation Scotland Bill, and also Section 16.2 of the Commissioner for Children and Young People Scotland Act 2003. So I move Amendment 1, and I hope that the committee supports it.
Thank you very much. Any other member wish to contribute? If not, then I'll ask Andy Whiteman.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much, Convener. And I'd just like to echo the Cabinet Secretary's opening remarks and thank her and her team officials for constructive engagement to this point. Amendment 1 is one of the amendments lodged by the Aileen Campbell, Cabinet Secretary, that I did not add my name in support of. This was due to the fact that I didn't have time to consider it fully ahead of the lodging deadline. And indeed, this is the first time I've heard the justification for the amendment. Now, I understand the rationales presented by the Cabinet Secretary for the amendment, and I would emphasise that there's nothing problematic in either of the two declarations referred to by the Cabinet Secretary, which were made by the UK when it ratified the treaty. However, my reason for opposing this amendment at this stage is broader and one of principle. I do not believe that Scottish ministers should be bound by the Charter articles only to the extent that the UK as a state is bound by those articles in international law. My view is that the incorporation of the Charter into Scots law should subsist for so long as the bill, if enacted, is not amended or repealed, and even if the UK departs from the terms of the Charter at the level of international law. Now, the effect of the amendment, as I understand it, would be that if the UK made new declarations, then the content of the obligations under the bill would change. Because Amendment 1 seeks to mirror the UK obligations internationally, as they may be enforced from time to time, it would, in my view, undermine this policy intention and effectively puts the ongoing policy purpose of the bill squarely in the hands of the UK government. And that's a strange policy position for any MSP in the Scottish Parliament to adopt. I believe that it's likely that a court would, in any event, interpret the Charter articles by reference to the two existing UK declarations without the need for the amendment, as they were the basis for UK ratification in 1988. So I don't believe Amendment 1 is necessary for that reason. And if further declarations were to be made on behalf of the UK state in the future, a Scottish Government could reflect those new declarations or reservations by seeking to amend the Act through primary legislation. That would be my preference, a process that would allow consideration as to whether any new limitations on the UK's international law obligations need to be reflected in the Act as a matter of domestic law, rather than a situation where this would be automatic, which I believe would be the effect of Amendment 1. And finally, on a drafting level, the language of the amendment appears to me to be a straight carry-over from the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child Incorporation Scotland Bill in Section 1.3. The Charter, however, as a Council of Europe treaty, uses language of declarations and denunciations. And so far as I'm aware, there are no provisions in the Charter for objections, which is one of the terms used in this amendment. So I'm not supportive of this amendment at this stage. I would like to have further conversations with the Cabinet Secretary about the exact purpose of this, and indeed whether it is the case that this could potentially stray into reserve matters. That's the first I've heard of that concern, and rather than vote this through at the moment, I'd rather have those conversations to stage in advance of stage 3. But obviously, I'm in the hands of the committee as to what you wish to do with this proposal before you. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much, Andy. Cabinet Secretary, would you like to wind up?
Convener, and I have a great deal of sympathy with much of what Andy Wightman has set out. I recognise as well that this issue emerged fairly late on in the day. However, nonetheless, it's something that we can't ignore. And in pursuit of what I believe is the positive outcome that this bill will bring, we need to be alive to the risk posed that this bill may not receive royal consent for the legal arguments that I have set out. This amendment would remove that risk. It won't change the policy intent, and as Andy Wightman himself pointed out, it is already something that has been presented within other bills. I mentioned the UNCRC bill and also the Children's Commissioner as well. So it's something that's not unusual, albeit it's within this kind of constitutional framework. It's not an unusual provision within a bill. It's not something new. It has been used and has been put in and inserted into other bits of legislation. It takes away the risk that this bill does not may not receive royal consent. And I think in pursuit of getting this bill to the place that we all want it, which is passed and enacted, I believe that removing the risk that is there is worth agreeing to this amendment for. Therefore, I will push and press the amendment in my name. However, ahead of stage 3, I will commit to continuing the dialogue with Andy Wightman to further reflect upon any refinements or any other suggestions that he may wish to pose ahead of stage 3. So I will continue the dialogue, but the risk is there. It's important that I point that out to the committee, and hopefully you can understand that in doing so, it's in the pursuit of ensuring that this bill gets to the place that we want it to, which is enacted and doing the positive things that we all agree that it can achieve. But we'll continue to engage with the member in charge of the bill ahead of stage 3, but want to continue to push this amendment.
Okay, thank you. The question therefore is that Amendment 1 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Andy, you are opposing this? Yes? Sorry, I can't see anything in the chat.
Convener, my understanding is I don't have a vote.
Oh, right. My apologies, yeah. Okay. The question is that Amendment 1 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes? We are agreed. I call Amendment 2 in the name of Andy Wightman, grouped with Amendments 3 and 4. Andy Wightman to move Amendment 2 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Thank you very much, Convener. I move Amendment 2. Amendment 2 and 4 in my name are technical amendments to address an ambiguity in language in Section 2.2 of the bill. This was drawn to the attention of the committee in written evidence by Professor Chris Hemsworth, and it relates to how the definition of act, as including failure to act, in subsection 2 interacts with subsection 1. The effect of the formulation proposed by the amendments provides for better consistency of language between sections 1 and 2. I believe it's clearer and would be more effective in making both acts and failures to act challengeable in court if they appear to be incompatible with the Charter articles. The nature of the duty on ministers in section 2 and its effect otherwise remains unchanged. Amendment 3 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary helps clarify what's excluded from the Section 2 duty on Scottish ministers to act compatibly with the Charter, and for that reason I support Amendment 3. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And before we go any further forward, I'm going to suspend. Aye. The question is that Amendment 1 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. The question is that Section 1 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We're agreed. And the question is that Scheduled 1 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Thank you. We are all agreed. I call Amendment 2 in the name of Andy Whiteman, grouped with Amendments 3 and 4. Andy Whiteman to move Amendment 2 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Thank you very much, Convener. I move Amendment 2. Amendments 2 and 4 are technical amendments to address an ambiguity in language in Section 2.2 of the Bill that was drawn to the Committee's attention by Professor Himsworth in written evidence. And it relates to how the definition of act, the word act, as including, quote, failure to act in subsection 2, interacts with subsection 1. The effect of the formulation proposed by the amendment provides for better consistency of language between subsections 1 and 2. I believe it's clearer and would be more effective in making both acts and failures to act challengeable in court if they appear to be incompatible with the Charter articles. Now, the nature of the duty on ministers themselves under section 2 remains otherwise unchanged. Amendment 3 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary helps clarify what's excluded from the Section 2 duty on ministers to act compatibly with the Charter, and for that reason I support Amendment 3. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. Cabinet Secretary to speak to Amendment 3 and other amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. As indicated by Mr Whiteman, Amendments 2 and 4 are technical amendments that deal with the way that the critical duty in Section 2 is interpreted and applied. The discussions on this issue were probably the longest and most technical between our teams, and I'm pleased that we have been able to work together and agree that the new formulation of the duty, as proposed by the member, clarifies its effect and ensures that Section 2 works as intended. Amendment 3 in my name is a technical amendment that amends the exclusion from the definition of functions in Section 2.2 so that the Section 2.1 duty does not apply to the preparation or introduction of or the exercise of other functions in relation to bills. Essentially, it makes two minor adjustments. Firstly, it clarifies the intended effect by excluding from Section 2.1 duty functions which specifically relate to bills rather than primary legislation more broadly. Secondly, it replaces the term promotion, as it's not a term normally used to describe the progress of a bill through Parliament. Promotion may not cover some of the Scottish Minister's parliamentary and non-parliamentary functions in relation to bills. As an example, the function of lodging a motion to withdraw a bill in accordance with Rule 9.13 of the Parliament Standing Orders would not be promotion of the bill. So the effect of Amendment 3 is to make it clear that the functions excluded from the Section 2.1 duty are not only the preparation or introduction of bills, but also the exercise of other parliamentary and non-parliamentary functions in relation to bills. Accordingly, I would ask members to support Amendment 3 in my name and also to support Andy Whiteman's Amendments 2 and 4.
Thank you very much. Do any other members have any comment to make? If not, then I ask Andy Whiteman to wind up and press withdraw.
Thank you very much, Convener. I have nothing to say in winding up, and I press Amendment 2.
Okay, thank you. The question is that Amendment 2 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are all agreed. Thank you very much. Call Amendment 3 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 2. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Formally moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 3 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Thank you. Call Amendment 4 in the name of Andy Whiteman, already debated with Amendment 2. Andy Whiteman to move or not move?
Move.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 4 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. The question is that Section 2 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Thank you very much. I call Amendment 5 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary and a group on its own. Cabinet Secretary to move and speak to Amendment 5.
Thank you, Convener. The purpose of Amendment 5 is to clarify the scope of the consultation duty in Section 3. It amends Section 3.4 to specifically require the Scottish Ministers, in complying with their duties under Section 3.1 and 2, to consult such persons appearing to them to be representative of the interests of local authorities. This covers consultation with COSLA, SOLAS and any other similar representative body and local authorities. I believe it's right that the interests of local authorities should be highlighted as being of special importance given the bill's purpose and the fact that consultation is an essential part of the duty to promote local self-government. Amendment 5 also requires the Scottish Ministers to consult such other persons as they consider appropriate. This covers any other person whom the Scottish Ministers consider to have a particular interest in local self-government and the autonomy of local authorities. This would include academics with relevant expertise in relation to those matters. So I would ask members to support this amendment, and I move Amendment 5 in my name.
Okay, thank you very much. Andy?
Thank you, Convener. I have nothing to add to what the Cabinet Secretary said on Amendment 5, which I support.
Okay, in that case, Cabinet Secretary, would you like to wind up?
Convener.
Okay, well, the question is that Amendment 5 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. The question is that Section 3 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Thank you. I call Amendment 6 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, grouped with Amendments 7 and 8. Cabinet Secretary to move Amendment 6 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. Amendments 6, 7 and 8 are minor and technical amendments that make clear that the interpretation duty in Section 4 of the bill is to apply only to acts and subordinate legislation to the extent that their provisions are within the legislative competence of the Scottish Parliament. So, in summary, it's very short, succinct kind of opening remarks for that, because they are technical in nature, and I move Amendment 6 in my name and ask members to support all the amendments in this group.
I see no other members wishing to speak, so would Andy Whiteman like to come in?
Thanks, Convener. For the record, I have nothing to add to what the Cabinet Secretary said on Amendments 6, 7 and 8, and I support all three amendments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Cabinet Secretary, would you like to wind up?
Convener.
And you have moved, yes.
Oh, I formally moved, if that helps.
The question is that Amendment 6 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are all agreed. Thank you. I call Amendment 7 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 6. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Formally moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 7 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are. Thank you. I call Amendment 8 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 6. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Formally moved.
The question is that Amendment 8 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are all agreed. And the question is that Section 4 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are all agreed to that. Section 4 has been agreed to. Thank you. I call Amendment 9 in the name of Andy Whiteman, grouped with Amendments 10 and 11. Andy Whiteman to move Amendment 9 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. I move Amendment 9. Amendment 9 is a technical amendment to provide clarity that the court referred to in subsection 5A is the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom, responds to a point raised by Professor Chris Himsworth in his written evidence to the committee. Amendments 10 and 11 are, again, technical amendments. Together, they adjust the positioning of the word only in subsection 7, and the effect is to provide greater clarity that a declaration of incompatibility can be made in respect of a provision only if the provision is within the legislative competence of the Scottish Parliament. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. There's no other members appear to wish to participate. The Cabinet Secretary.
As Mr Whiteman has already said, the amendments in this group are minor and technical in nature. Amendment 9 is a clarifying amendment, and as Andy Whiteman has already said, it makes it explicit that the Supreme Court referred to in section 558 is the Supreme Court of the UK, and amendments 10 and 11 likewise make minor adjustments to section 5.7 to clarify its effect. So therefore, again, I support Andy Whiteman's amendments 9 and 10 and 11 and would also ask members to vote in favour of them.
Thank you. Andy, to wind up, press or withdraw?
I have nothing to add and I press Amendment 9.
Thank you, Andy. The question is that Amendment 9 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. I call Amendment 10 in the name of Andy Whiteman, already debated with Amendment 9. Andy Whiteman to move or not move?
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 10 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Thank you. I call Amendment 11 in the name of Andy Whiteman, already debated with Amendment 9. Andy Whiteman to move or not move?
Moved, Convener.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 11 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are all agreed. The question is that Section 5 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are all agreed. Section 5 has been agreed to. I call Amendment 19 in the name of Andy Whiteman, grouped with Amendments 13 and 13A. Andy Whiteman to move Amendment 19 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Thank you very much, Convener, and I move Amendment 19. This amendment addresses an issue raised by the DPLR Committee in a letter to me on the 9th of October 2020 and in its report on the bill. It is not the policy intention that the delegated power in Section 6 of the bill should be used to create criminal offences or to modify any existing offences. And Amendment 19 puts this clearly on the face of the bill, and I'm confident and hopeful that this does indeed address the issue raised by the DPLR Committee. Amendment 13 is a substantive policy amendment. In my name, it introduces a super-affirmative procedure for regulations made under the powers delegated to ministers by Section 6 of the bill. Now, the DPLR Committee, in its Stage 1 scrutiny of the bill, and the Law Society of Scotland, in its written evidence to the committee at Stage 1, commented on the breadth of these powers. The delegated powers under Section 6.1 are intentionally broad to ensure that they can be used to address a declaration of incompatibility, however the courts choose to express it. The powers are only available to Scottish ministers under very specific circumstances, namely in the event that a court makes a declaration of incompatibility in respect of a provision, either of an act or subordinate legislation, and if they consider it necessary or expedient to use them in consequence of such a declaration. Now, having reflected on feedback during stage 1 evidence, I have decided that additional checks and balances are appropriate in relationship to the powers in section 6. And so I have proposed here in this amendment a super affirmative procedure and think that would be the most appropriate way to deal with the issue. So the effect of this amendment, therefore, is to introduce a super affirmative procedure and to ensure enhanced scrutiny for any regulations made by Scottish ministers under section 6.1. It introduces a period of at least 60 days during which the Parliament can undertake the required scrutiny. This will be facilitated by a statement that must accompany a draft of the proposed regulations, in which ministers must clearly outline, firstly, the nature of the incompatibility that the draft regulations relate to, secondly, how they address that incompatibility, thirdly, whether they include any provision that goes beyond what is necessary to address the incompatibility, and if so, why that provision is included, and finally, why ministers are using the power, are proposing to use the power under section 6.1, as opposed to remedying the incompatibility by any other action, for example, by introducing primary legislation. Amendment 13A, in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, is an amendment to my Amendment 13, and it seeks to add the possibility to expedite the procedure by dispensing with the 60-day pre-laying period. Now, I understand in the context of other legislation, such as human rights, where ministers may have to act really quite fast in consequence of any declarations of incompatibility on human rights. But I do not believe that the remedial action powers in this bill would ever require an expedited procedure. A declaration of incompatibility by the courts would not affect the validity or continuing operation of a provision, and so the law would not need to be changed immediately as a consequence of a declaration. Furthermore, I believe it's very, very unlikely that any cases will arise related to this bill that would be so urgent that the 60-day pre-laying period would need to be dispensed with. If there ever were such a situation, of course, there's always the scope for emergency legislation, and therefore I do not support Amendment 13A. Thank you, Convener.
Yes, thank you very much. Cabinet Secretary to speak to Amendment 13A and other amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. Amendment 19, lodged by Mr Whiteman, which provides that regulations under Section 6 of the bill must not create, widen the scope of or increase the penalty for a criminal offence, deals with an issue raised by the TPLR committee during stage 1, and I'm happy to support that amendment. Amendment 13, lodged by Andy Whiteman, requires that at least 60 days before laying an SSI containing regulations under Section 6 of the bill, the Scottish ministers must lay before Parliament a draft of the regulations and an explanatory statement. This was done as a response to concerns raised again by the DPLR committee at stage 1, and Mr Whiteman has responded by proposing that the power in Section 6 should be subject to super affirmative procedure, and I'm pleased also to support Amendment 13. I believe, though, that Amendment 13A, lodged in my name as an amendment to Andy Whiteman's Amendment 13, would help to future-proof the bill. The effect of Amendment 13A would allow for a draft SSI to be put before Parliament before the expiry of the 60-day requirement put forward in Amendment 13. Scottish ministers would need to explain why the 60-day requirement was not being met. Now, I accept the position of Andy Whiteman set out in his letter to the committee dated on the 19th of February that the law will not need to change immediately as a consequence of a declaration of incompatibility, and it is unlikely that issues related to this bill, local government law, would require an expedited process. However, I would emphasise the term unlikely, because unlikely is not never. That prospect is not eliminated. So Amendment 13A provides for an exception to allow the additional pre-laying period of 60 days to be dispensed with. If there is no exception, the pre-laying period of 60 days will apply to all regulations under section 6.1 on top of the conventional affirmative laying period of 54 days. That means that from when draft regulations and an explanatory statement are laid to when the SSI is made, it could be 114 sitting days. And depending on when in the year the draft regs and explanatory statement are laid, that could equate up to 8 months. The committee commented in its Stage 1 report on the legal uncertainty that arose from the bill, and this was also part of contributions from members during Stage 1 debate. It is this uncertainty that means that the bill should provide for a degree of flexibility within the procedure put in place by Amendment 13. My Amendment 13A seeks to provide an exception for unforeseen circumstances in which it would be desirable to act more quickly than the procedure under Amendment 13 allows, but where the circumstances do not justify an emergency bill. Amendment 13A does not eliminate the elements put in place by Amendment 13. It still has the requirements for Scottish ministers to lay before Parliament an explanatory statement and a draft of the regulations before laying a draft SSI containing the regulations for approval. In addition, Amendment 13A requires Scottish ministers to explain to the presiding officer why the 60-day requirement was not being met. Crucially, it doesn't prevent effective parliamentary scrutiny, as the draft SSI will still be subject to affirmative procedure with a conventional laying period of 54 days. That means the regulations cannot be made without parliamentary scrutiny and the approval of the Parliament. I think that's a really important point to stress. But it does, though, offer a practical and a sensible solution to ensure that this bill provides the correct balance of flexibility and scrutiny where there is a need to act more quickly than is provided for under Amendment 13. Scottish ministers are unlikely to rely on an exception to the Amendment 13 process often. However, I hope that members are persuaded that there may be circumstances in the future where it may be required, and it is better, I think, to build in that flexibility now. So I would urge members to support the Amendment 13A in my name, but also Amendments 19 and 13 put forward by Andy Whiteman.
Okay, thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. The question is that Amendment 19 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are all agreed. The question is that Section 6 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are all agreed. Thank you. I call Amendment 13 in the name of Andy Whiteman, already debated with Amendment 19. Andy Whiteman, to move or not move?
Move, Convener.
Thank you. I call Amendment 13A in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 19. Cabinet Secretary, to move formally.
Formally moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 13A be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We're all agreed. Andy Whiteman, to press or withdraw Amendment 13 as amended. The question is that Amendment 13 as amended be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We're all agreed. I call Amendment 14 in the name of Andy Whiteman, grouped with Amendments 15, 16 and 17. Andy Whiteman, to move Amendment 14 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. Sorry, paperwork. I move Amendment 14. Amendment 14 and 15 are technical amendments. They provide a slight restructuring of Section 7.1b to make it clear that the test set out in paragraph II, like that in subparagraph I, is something that requires a court to reach a view and not just a matter of fact. Amendment 16 is a technical amendment for clarification. Section 7.1 of the bill currently states that one of the circumstances, power to remove or limit the retrospective effect of a court decision or suspend its effect, is to be available to a court as per paragraph B, where a pre-existing subordinate legislation is found to be incompatible. Now, at present, this is defined by reference to when the Act comes into force. This risks causing uncertainty as there is no single date on which the Act comes into force, and the effect of this amendment, therefore, is that the test is changed whether Section 2 is in force. And the reason for this is that as soon as Section 2 is in force, ministers are under the duty to ensure that anything they do, including making subordinate legislation, Charter compatible, and as a result, if Charter incompatible subordinate legislation is made after that date, it would constitute a breach of Section 2 duty, and the Section 7 powers are already available for that scenario by virtue of Section 7(1)(a). Amendment 17 is another technical amendment. It clarifies that what determines the availability to a court of the Section 7 power is the nature of the legislation. For example, subordinate legislation. That is to say, subordinate legislation where primary legislation does not prevent the removal of the incompatible subordinate legislation, and not which court it happens to be. As currently drafted, there is a risk that Section 7(1)(bii) of the bill could be misinterpreted. And finally, Amendment 17 removes the risk of the provision being misinterpreted by rewording it as the converse of the condition in Section 5(4)(b). I apologise, Convener, those are technical amendments, but I assure the committee that they're worthwhile, and I would welcome support for them. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. Cabinet Secretary?
Amendments 14, 15, 16, 17, as Andy Whiteman has said, are technical amendments that improve the clarity in Section 7, and I support the amendments lodged by Mr Whiteman.
Thank you. Andy Whiteman to wind up and press or withdraw.
Nothing to add, Convener, and I press Amendment 14.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 14 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. I call Amendments 15, 16 and 17, all in the name of Andy Whiteman and all previously debated with Amendment 14. Andy Whiteman to move Amendments 15 to 17 on block.
Moved on block, Convener.
Does any member object to a single question being put on Amendments 15 to 17? Okay, thank you. The question is therefore that Amendments 15 to 17 are agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are all agreed. The question is that Section 7 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We're all agreed. The question is that Sections 8 and 9 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? And again, thank you very much. I call Amendment 18 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary and a group on its own. Cabinet Secretary to move and speak to Amendment 18.
Thank you, Convener. Amendment 18 inserts a new section that confers power on Scottish ministers to make ancillary provision, and I believe it's a positive change that I hope will improve the bill. It's a standard provision, which is a feature of many bills that have passed through this Parliament. And that includes the UNCRC Incorporation Scotland Bill, another incorporation bill. The purpose of conferring this new power on Scottish ministers is to allow for greater flexibility in giving full effect to the Act or any provision made under it. Whilst ancillary provisions are not always needed, they provide a very useful implementation tool and safeguard. They are used proportionately and appropriately. For instance, consequential provision may be required to make necessary changes to related legislation. Incidental or supplementary provision may be required to address any oversight or unforeseen situation. This might involve filling in some detail which is consistent with but missing from the resulting Act and which is required to make it work. Transitional, transitory or saving provision may also be required to deal with any legislative changes made by virtue of the Act, in particular by regulations under Section 6(1). This could help tailor their application and effect before the new law comes into force. It could also help manage the impact of any changes on the existing functions of local authorities. Given the potential need for incidental, supplementary or consequential provision, the power expressly enables the modification of any enactment, and that includes the Act itself. The ancillary power is limited in that it must only be used where appropriate for the purposes of, or in connection with, or for giving full effect to the Act or any provisions made under it. It would be out with the scope of the power to use it to subvert or undermine the substantive effect of any of the Act's provisions. It could not be used to make provision that is contrary to or inconsistent with the Act's purposes or provisions. Without the power to make ancillary provision, it may be necessary to return to the Parliament with another bill to deal with a matter which is clearly within the scope and policy intention of the bill. Again, I would emphasise the need for flexibility. Finally, any regulations made under the proposed new section would be subject to the affirmative procedure and so would require to be closely scrutinised and approved by Parliament. And I know the DPLR Committee in particularly carefully scrutinises the scope and substance of any subordinate legislation that contains ancillary provisions. So therefore, I move Amendment 18 in my name and would ask members also to support.
Thank you very much. I see no other members wish to participate, so Andy Whiteman.
Thank you very much, Convener. Members will, I hope, be familiar with ancillary provisions as they do often indeed appear in bills. They are, however, in my view, rarely scrutinised as such. Now, my bill contains no ancillary provisions as I considered that none were necessary, and you are now, as committee, being invited to decide whether ancillary provisions should be inserted via Amendment 18. And in discussions over the past few weeks with the Cabinet Secretary and her officials, I've expressed scepticism about the necessity of such provisions and emphasised that the onus is very much on the Cabinet Secretary to justify here before you why they are necessary, their precise scope, and whether, in particular, including regulation-making powers that can modify the Act itself are necessary. And having heard what the Cabinet Secretary has said, this is the first time I've heard on the record the precise purpose of ancillary provisions, when they can be used, when they can't be used, the role of the DPLR committee, all of which I think is very helpful for members. And to that extent, and on balance, I am satisfied that she has set out for the record purposes of these provisions. Although not with the greatest enthusiasm, I am content to recommend that the committee support Amendment 18. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. And the Cabinet Secretary, you'd like to wind up?
Yeah, thank you, and I'm grateful to Andy Whiteman for indicating his support, albeit with the caveat of that he put forward. But I would reiterate to the committee that this is a standard provision. It enables us to have greater flexibility and give full effect to the Act or any provisions made under it. The power is limited. It will have appropriate scrutiny attached to it. It will be scrutinised under affirmative procedure, and the power would be used proportionately and appropriately with the aim of implementing the bill's provisions fully, effectively and efficiently in accordance with the will of Parliament. So I hope to underline again those parameters which set out clearly that it will be for Parliament to scrutinise any use of this, but also enables us to have the flexibility that will be so necessary for this bill, but would only be used proportionally and appropriately going forward, if at all. So I'm pleased that the member has indicated his support and would urge members of the committee to do likewise, and therefore I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. The question is that Amendment 18 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Oh, we are agreed. The question is that sections 10 and 11 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are. The question is that the long title be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are. And that ends stage 2 considered. Yes. Yes.
I would just like to observe that I was not given the chance to wind up on the group that included Amendment 13 and 13A. I just wish to say for the record that I look forward to some further conversations in relationship to Amendment 13A as amended to ensure perhaps that some of the language around it is improved a little bit. Apologies, Convener, for that late intervention, but I think if you...
My apologies for calling you earlier.
No problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy. Right, okay. The question is that sections 10 and 11 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are. The question is that the long title be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are again. And that ends stage 2 consideration of the bill. The bill will be reprinted as amended at stage 2 and will be published tomorrow morning. The Parliament has not yet determined when stage 3 will be held. Members will be informed of that in due course, along with the deadlines for lodging stage 3 amendments. In the meantime, Stage 3 amendments can be lodged with the clerks and the legislation team. Thank you very much for that. Thank the Cabinet Secretary for taking part in the meeting. Cabinet Secretary, you can leave the meeting by pressing the red telephone icon, and I remind committee members that we remain in public for the next item. Agenda item 4 is a consideration of negative instruments 59, 63, 64 and 65 as listed on the agenda. I refer members to paper number 3, which contains further detail. These instruments are laid under the negative procedure, which means that the provisions will come into force unless the Parliament agrees to a motion to annul them. No motions to annul have been laid. The Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee considered these instruments at its meeting on 16th of February 2021 and determined that it did not need to draw the attention of the Parliament to the instruments on any grounds within its remit. Does anyone have any comments on the instruments? Could you put an R in the chat box? Sarah, Boyack.
Thank you very much, Convener. I particularly want to welcome the fact that the non-domestic rates, district heating relief and renewable energy generation relief regulations are in front of us this morning. It's something you might remember from the non-domestic rates bill we had discussions on last year. This was one of the issues I raised. So I'm very pleased to see it in front of us today, especially given we passed the heat networks bill at stage 3 yesterday. So the only thing I wanted to put on the record is that I hope the impact of the regulations will be reviewed by the Scottish Government, particularly given that there's a reduction in non-domestic rates from 2021 through to the year 2023 to 24, and I think it's quite a short timescale, so I hope the Scottish Government will keep an eye on that and potentially come back with a potential extension, because getting heat networks up and running is quite a challenging process, and it's important that this statutory instrument actually delivers what the government and certainly I hope it will deliver in practice. Thanks, Convener.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Sarah, and your comments, of course, will be on the record. I invite the committee to agree that it does not wish to make any recommendations in relation to these instruments. Does anyone object? No, in that case that is agreed. That concludes the public part of this meeting, and we will resume the meeting in private in Microsoft Teams. I propose we resume the meeting in private in 5 minutes. Please accept the clerk's meeting request for the private discussion, which will be sent shortly, and I now suspend the meeting. Thank you.